The casino floor of the Aurelius smelled like money and desperation, a combination Mia Fontaine had always found intoxicating. She stood at the entrance for exactly 3 seconds, the way she always did. 3 seconds to read the room. 3 seconds to locate the exits, the cameras, the pit bosses, the men in suits who were paid not to gamble but to watch. 3 seconds to decide whether tonight was going to be easy or interesting. Tonight, she decided, would be interesting. She was wearing a dress the color of aged burgundy wine, deep, almost black in the low light, with a neckline that suggested without announcing. Her dark hair was pulled up in a way that looked effortless and had taken 40 minutes. She wore no jewelry except a single bracelet on her left wrist, a thin chain of white gold that had belonged to her mother, who had also been a woman who understood that the most dangerous thing a person could carry was the appearance of harmlessness. Mia was 29 years old. In the 7 years since she'd first sat down at a serious poker table, she had relieved 11 casinos of a combined total of $4.3 million. Not all at once, not through any single spectacular heist, but through the slow, deliberate work of reading people, the way a card player read tells, the way a surgeon read anatomy, and knowing precisely when to push, when to fold, and when to walk away before the men in suits decided she was more trouble than she was worth. She had never been caught. She had come very close, twice. The Aurelius was not, technically, a casino. It occupied the top 4 floors of a building in downtown Chicago that officially housed a private members club. You needed an invitation to get past the lobby. You needed a second invitation, delivered through channels that didn't advertise themselves, to get past the 3rd floor. The games above the 3rd floor were not registered with the Illinois Gaming Board. The men and women who played them were not the kind of people who filed complaints with regulatory agencies. Mia had spent 3 weeks getting her invitation. She crossed the floor slowly, navigating between clusters of men in bespoke suits and women in dresses that cost more than most people's cars. The decor was aggressively understated. Dark wood paneling, low chandeliers of amber glass, leather chairs in shades of cognac and deep green. The art on the walls was real. The flowers on the tables were fresh. The staff moved like trained shadows, appearing and disappearing exactly when needed, their faces arranged in expressions of professional neutrality that Mia had always admired as a kind of high art. She stopped at the bar and ordered a glass of Barolo. She didn't drink it. She held it, because a woman holding a glass at a bar was furniture, and furniture didn't attract attention. She was looking for the baccarat table in the back room, the one she'd been told about by a man named Lenny, who owed her a favor and paid his debts in information. The table where the buy-in was $50,000, and the house had been winning for 6 consecutive months without a single significant loss. That kind of consistency in gambling was not luck. It was either cheating, or it was the presence of someone at the table who was better than everyone else in the room. Mia wanted to know which. "You're holding that glass like it offended you." The voice came from her left, low, unhurried, with the faintest suggestion of an Italian accent, smoothed almost entirely away by years of American vowels. The kind of accent that only surfaced under very specific circumstances. She turned. The man standing beside her was tall, taller than she'd registered from her peripheral vision, well over 6 feet. He was dressed in a suit so dark it was nearly colorless, the jacket cut with a precision that bordered on architectural. His hair was black and worn short, the kind of short that required maintenance. His face was, she processed it in the automatic, calculating way she processed everything, angular, composed, and arranged in an expression of complete disinterest that she recognized immediately as performance. Nobody who was actually disinterested made the effort to look it. He was, she noted, with the detached part of her brain that cataloged such things, extraordinarily attractive. The kind of attractive that came from bone structure and certainty rather than any particular softness. "It's a Barolo," she said. "It's been open too long. It's oxidizing." "You can tell that without tasting it?" "The color. It's gone slightly brick at the edges. It's been open at least 2 hours. She tilted the glass slightly toward the amber light. Probably 3. A pause, not an uncomfortable one. He looked at the glass the way she'd described, and she watched something move through his expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite approval. Something in between those two things that was more interesting than either. "You know wine," he said. "I know things that people underestimate," she said. He looked at her then, fully, the way men in rooms like this rarely looked at women, not with acquisition in mind, but with something more focused, something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. "Caesar Vitali," he said. He didn't offer his hand. She noticed that. He simply said his name the way a person announces a fact about the weather, as though the information was available and she could do with it whatever she liked. She knew the name. She'd known it before she walked in the door. She'd spent 2 of her 3 weeks of preparation learning everything she could about Caesar Vitali, who was 36 years old, the eldest son of Marco Vitali of the Chicago Vitali family, who had expanded their operation from traditional family business, which was a polite way of saying extortion, protection, and logistics, into what his father had called legitimate enterprise, and what Caesar had transformed into something that was legitimate only in the technical sense that it was difficult to prosecute. He owned 6 private gaming establishments across the country. He had a stake in 3 hotel properties, a shipping company, and a vineyard in Tuscany that actually produced wine. He had never been indicted. He had been investigated 4 times. He was, by every account she'd been able to assemble, a man who did not lose. "Mia Fontaine," she said. She watched for a reaction. There was none, which was itself a reaction. The practiced non-response of a man who had already known her name before she said it. "I know," he said. The 2 words landed with a weight that she felt in the back of her neck. "Then you know why I'm here," she said. "You're here to play," he said. "Whether you're here to win is a more interesting question." He picked up his own glass, a whiskey, neat, which she had been holding the same way she'd been holding her wine, as accessory rather than beverage, and turned away from her toward the back of the room. Not walking away, simply turning, an implicit invitation in the angle of his shoulders. She followed, because she had not come this far to stand at a bar with an oxidizing Barolo. The back room was separated from the main floor by a door that didn't look like a door, a panel of dark wood that swung inward when Caesar pressed his palm briefly against its edge. Inside, the aesthetic shifted from opulent casual to something that felt older and more intentional. A single table at the center of the room, lit from above by a focused chandelier that left the perimeter in shadow. 5 chairs, 3 of them occupied. At the table sat 2 men and a woman Mia didn't recognize and hadn't been able to research, which meant they were either very new to this world or very careful about being in it. The dealer, young, black, with the kind of stillness that serious dealers cultivated, stood behind a shoe of cards that hadn't been cut yet. "The 6th chair," Caesar said, and it was not a question. Mia sat down. Across the table, one of the men, heavy-set, wearing a gold watch that was doing too much work, looked at her with an expression that was half appreciation and half dismissal. She'd seen that look 1,000 times. It was the look that made her the most money. She placed her chip stack on the table. The dealer cut the shoe. The game began. For the first hour, Mia played conservatively. She always played conservatively in the first hour. She was reading, not the cards, because the cards were the least important thing at a table, but the players. The way the heavy-set man's jaw tightened when he held something good, a tell so obvious she almost felt sorry for him. The way the woman in the white jacket touched her left earlobe when she was calculating odds. The way the third man, young and dark-eyed and very still, barely registered at all, which meant he was either exceptional or had nothing to lose. And the way Caesar played. He sat to her left, which meant she could see his face in 3/4 profile when he looked at his cards. She saw nothing. Not a flicker, not a held breath, not the microscopic tightening of muscle around the eyes that even very practiced players produced. He played with the same unhurried calm with which he delivered his name, as though the outcome were already settled, and the cards were simply the process of arriving at a conclusion he already knew. It was the most interesting thing she'd ever seen at a card table. By the end of the second hour, she had doubled her stack. The heavyset man was down significantly. The woman in the white jacket had left. The young, dark-eyed man had tripled his chips and was watching the room with the same focused stillness. Only Caesar's stack had not changed appreciably, not grown, not shrunk, hovering in a precise equilibrium that she couldn't decide was deliberate or effortless. "You're good," he said, during a break between hands, without looking at her. "You already knew that," she said. Knowing something and seeing it are different experiences. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. His profile in the low light was the kind of thing a sculptor would have wept about. "What are you getting out of tonight?" she asked. He turned then, and the full weight of his attention was something she felt physically, in her sternum, like a hand pressed flat against her chest. "I haven't decided yet," he said. The dealer began to shuffle. Mia picked up her cards. The night deepened around them like water around a stone, and she had the distinct, disorienting sensation, one she had never experienced in 7 years of doing this, that she was not entirely in control of the situation. She found, to her considerable alarm, that she did not entirely mind. She walked out of the Aurelius at 2:17 in the morning, with $43,000 in chips that she had already arranged to have converted through a contact at the cage. Not under her real name, which was not Mia Fontaine. Her real name was Amelia Grace Rousseau. She had stopped using it at 22, when it became clear that the life she intended to lead would be better served by a name that didn't trail the ghost of a family she'd carefully left behind. The Fontaine had been her mother's maiden name. The Mia was the name her mother had called her when they were alone. A private thing, an intimate syllable that Amelia Grace Rousseau had taken with her as the only inheritance she wanted. She was standing in the cold outside, waiting for the car she'd called, when the man appeared beside her. Not Caesar. One of Caesar's, that was immediately clear. He was broad-shouldered and had the kind of posture that came from years of physical alertness. He was wearing a dark overcoat and holding a small envelope, white, unsealed. "Mr. Vitali would like you to have this," the man said. Mia took the envelope without changing her expression. She'd learned that as one of the first rules of the work. Whatever you're given, accept it with the face you'd use to receive a restaurant menu. She turned the envelope over. On the back, in handwriting that was angular and extremely deliberate, was a single line. "Dinner. Tomorrow. 8 o'clock. C.V." No address, no restaurant name, no question mark. She looked up at the man. "Is there a location?" "The car will come at 7:45, he said. "I haven't accepted." "He knows," the man said. He turned and walked back through the door she'd come out of, and the door closed behind him with the soft, definitive sound of a room that didn't need to raise its voice. Mia held the envelope for a moment, looking at the 2 words and the 2 initials, and the cold Chicago air moved around her and made no suggestions. She accepted. The car arrived at 7:44, which she noted as the first suggestion that Caesar Vitali was a man who understood the particular authority of arriving slightly early. It was a black car, long, the kind of vehicle that didn't display its maker's badge because people who knew cars knew what it was, and people who didn't know cars didn't need to know. The driver said nothing, which she appreciated. They drove for 23 minutes through streets that gradually shed the familiar grid of downtown Chicago and became something older and quieter, a residential neighborhood of substantial houses set back from tree-lined streets, the kind of neighborhood where money was old enough to be embarrassed by ostentation. They stopped in front of a building that was not a house. It was a 4-story structure of pale stone that had once been, she guessed, either a bank or a consulate. The ground floor windows were dark. The upper floors emitted a low, warm light. Inside, she was met not by a host or a maitre d', but by Caesar himself, which was the second unexpected thing of the evening. He was standing in the entrance hall in a suit the color of charcoal smoke, holding 2 glasses of red wine, and looking at her as though he'd been standing there for a while and hadn't minded. "You're 30 seconds early," she said. "You're 30 seconds early," he said, and handed her one of the glasses. "The Barolo, a different bottle. This one was opened 14 minutes ago." She took the glass. She sipped it. It was extraordinary, full and dark, with a mineral depth that she felt at the back of her throat long after she'd swallowed. "Better," she said. "Yes," he said. He led her through a corridor hung with paintings, not decorative, not chosen for scale or color coordination, but chosen for what she recognized as someone with genuine knowledge and genuine preference. A small Morandi still life. A drawing that looked like it might be Sheila. A landscape she couldn't place, but wanted to look at for longer than the corridor allowed. The dining room was a room she would have designed if she'd been designing rooms for herself, which was a thought that unsettled her, because she had never had that reaction to anyone's space before. A table for 2 near a window that looked onto a dark courtyard with a single lit stone fountain. Candles rather than overhead light. Books on shelves along one wall. Real books, red books, with broken spines and uneven heights. "You live here," she said. It was not the dinner venue. It was his home. "Part of the time," he said. "The other parts, I live in New York and in Italy. Tuscany." He pulled out her chair. "You've done your research." "Of course." He sat across from her. For a moment he said nothing, and neither did she, and the silence was the particular kind that wasn't empty. It was full of things being assessed and measured on both sides. "Why did you invite me?" she asked. "Because I wanted to." "That's not an answer." "It's the only honest one," he said. "I could give you a constructed answer. I could tell you it was professional curiosity, or that I wanted to understand your method, or that it's customary to dine with significant winners. All of those things have some degree of truth. But the actual reason is that I wanted to, and I'm a man who has learned that honest motivations, stated clearly, are less dangerous than the alternatives." She looked at him. He held her gaze without strain. "Last night," she said, "you knew who I was before you introduced yourself." "Yes." "And you knew what I was doing at the table." "Yes." "Then why allow it?" He tilted his wine glass slightly. "Because watching you work is—" He paused, and the pause was precise, not hesitant. "Remarkable. You don't read cards, you read people. You were mapping tells in the first 10 minutes that most professional players wouldn't identify in an hour. The way you adjusted your stack management the moment you identified the man with the gold watch as an emotional player. The way you went entirely passive for the first 45 minutes to establish a pattern you could break later." He paused again. "And the way you watched me." "Was I obvious?" she asked. "To someone who wasn't watching you back? No." The food arrived, brought by a person who materialized and disappeared with the same quality of shadow she'd noticed in the Aurelius staff. The meal was not elaborate. It was very good. Pasta with a sauce that tasted like someone's grandmother had been involved, and a secondi of lamb that was simple and perfectly seasoned. "You're Sicilian," she said. He looked up. "My mother's family. How—" "The food. Not a restaurant chef. Someone who learned this in a kitchen where it had been cooked the same way for generations." She ate a small bite. "This is the food of someone who grew up poor and got rich and kept the table." Something crossed his face then. Not discomfort, but something more intimate than she'd expected. She'd found a seam in the composed surface, and she wasn't sure whether she'd done it deliberately or by accident, and she wasn't sure which answer unsettled her more. "My grandmother," he said. "She cooked for every Sunday dinner until she died. She would have been appalled by the restaurants I keep." He said it without grief, with the comfortable distance of time. She also would have liked you. Why? Because she had no patience for people who were less intelligent than they appeared to be. She would have found you restful. Mia laughed, and the laugh surprised her. Genuine, short, the kind she couldn't have manufactured. She felt him register it, the way you felt a change in air pressure. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She considered being diplomatic and decided against it. Someone cruder. The profile I built, the family business, the expansion, the things you've done to protect your interests. It suggested someone with less, she searched for the word, interiority. He was quiet for a moment. "The things I've done to protect my interests," he repeated, slowly, tasting the phrasing. "That's a generous way to describe it. I'm not here to judge your business." "No," he said, "you're here because I invited you, and you're here because you're curious, and you're here because whatever I represent is more interesting to you than concerning." He looked at her. "Am I wrong?" She should have said, "Possibly." She should have maintained the ambiguity, because ambiguity was protection, and protection was the first principle she'd built her life around. "No," she said instead. He refilled her wine glass. By the end of dinner, she had told him about the oxidizing Barolo trick, about the fact that she'd grown up in New Orleans, about her mother. She had told him about her mother in the careful way she told people about things she actually cared about, obliquely, circling the subject without landing on it directly, giving enough to seem open while protecting the parts that mattered. And she had a strong and alarming suspicion that he'd seen exactly what she was doing. At the door, he did not touch her. He stood at the entrance of his stone building, and the cold air moved between them. And he looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been trying all evening to read and failing at in a way she had never previously failed at reading a face. "I'd like you to come back," he said. "To play?" she asked. "To come back," he said. She got into the waiting car, and it pulled away from the curb, and she sat in the dark back seat with her wine-warm blood and her pulse, doing something she considered medically unnecessary, and she stared at the city lights through the window and thought about the fact that for the first time in 7 years, she was looking forward to not leaving. She went back. 4 times in the next 2 weeks. Not because Caesar asked her to, though he did. Once, via a message delivered through the same process as the first. A card with handwriting that was becoming recognizable to her now, the way music was recognizable, by its particular rhythm. But because she found reasons to be in Chicago that she manufactured with less difficulty than she would have liked. On the second visit, he took her through the Aurelius at noon, when it was empty and the cleaning staff moved through the tables like tides. She had never seen a gambling establishment in daylight. The glamour died entirely without the low light and the crowd and the hum of money in motion. What remained was architecture, and the architecture, she discovered, was extraordinary. The bones of the building were those of a Prohibition-era speakeasy, and Caesar had renovated around them rather than through them, preserving the original stone columns and the pressed tin ceiling and the outline of what had been a stage for live music in a decade when people danced while the law looked for them. "You kept all of it," she said, touching one of the columns. "The new things don't have the weight yet," he said. "The old things earned it." She looked at him. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at the ceiling, and in the daylight he looked different than he did at night. Not less, but differently composed, the lines of him less theatrical, more simply present. "Your father built this?" she asked. "My father built a different version of this. I rebuilt what he'd built when I took over." A pause. "My father's version was profitable. Mine is something else." "What else?" He looked at her from across the empty room. "Legitimate," he said, "in the ways that matter to me, not in the ways that are detectable by the IRS." A slight dry movement of his mouth that she was beginning to learn was his version of a full smile. On the third visit, she played, not in the back room, but at one of the main tables, in the evening crowd, and he sat beside her for 40 minutes without playing, only watching. She was aware of his attention with a precision she couldn't account for by any physical sensation she could identify. It was like playing with a second gravitational field in the room, not pulling her off her game, but making her more intensely aware of every decision she made, as though they were being translated simultaneously into a language he was reading over her shoulder. She won $11,000 and felt more watched than she had in her life. Afterward, walking through the club, a man she didn't recognize stopped them, or rather stopped her, placing himself in her path with the deliberate casual positioning of someone who had done this before and expected it to work. He was attractive in an aggressive way, and he was looking at her with the particular entitlement of someone who was accustomed to having money smooth whatever he wanted to achieve. "I don't believe we've met," the man said, addressing Mia while performing the social calculation of checking Caesar's presence and deciding he was probably staff. That was his mistake. "You haven't," Caesar said. The temperature in the 3-foot radius around the man dropped perceptibly. Mia watched the man recalibrate in real time, the way the confident smile shifted, the way his eyes moved to Caesar's face and worked to find what they were looking at, the way something in his posture softened involuntarily in the way that bodies responded to certain kinds of authority before the brain caught up. "Caesar," the man said, and his voice had lost about 30% of its volume. "I didn't see you there." "I know," Caesar said. The man retreated. Not quickly, that would have been too obvious, but efficiently. He found a reason to be elsewhere within 20 seconds, and the 20 seconds were visible as exactly what they were. Caesar watched him go, with an expression so still it communicated more than most people's most animated faces. "You didn't have to do that," Mia said. "He was in your space," Caesar said, as though this were a sufficient and complete answer. And then, before she could form the particular response that was assembling itself in her chest, something that was half gratitude and half resistance, he said, "Drink?" And the moment resolved itself into forward motion. But she held it. She carried it into the next several days, along with a growing collection of details that she was assembling about him, the way she assembled intelligence on a casino, systematically, with the understanding that every detail would eventually be useful, while trying to ignore the secondary fact that she was enjoying the assembly process far more than operational necessity required. He was meticulous in ways that weren't about control, but about quality. He cared how things were made more than how they appeared, which was unusual in his world. He had read, genuinely read, more widely than anyone she'd met who hadn't been paid to do so. He spoke Italian when he thought she couldn't hear. On the phone, quickly, with a fluency that was different from his English, in a way that was not entirely easy to describe, except that in Italian, he sounded less constructed. He had a scar below his left ear that he didn't explain, and that she didn't ask about, though she thought about it. He had given her access to the Aurelius that was not available to any other non-member she'd heard of. He had introduced her to his staff, not by name, but by presence, a subtle registration of her as someone who was to be treated as present, as permanent, and she had watched the staff recalibrate accordingly. She knew what he was doing. She understood it structurally. This was a man bringing someone into his orbit, slowly, through accumulation of proximity and trust rather than declaration. It was patient and it was careful, and it was the method of someone who played long games. She was a woman who played long games herself. On the fourth visit, she arrived at the Aurelius to find that the back room was hosting a different kind of event. Not a game, but a meeting of the kind that didn't make agendas. 6 men around the baccarat table, with drinks and no cards, and the low register of voices speaking in the particular, careful cadence of men who were deciding things. She should have left. She knew, from the reaction of the man at the door, the slight pause before he admitted her, the way his eyes moved briefly toward the back wall, that she was arriving at a moment that was not intended for her. She didn't leave. She went to the bar and ordered a Barolo and waited. 20 minutes later, Caesar came through the door from the back room. He saw her immediately. She had chosen the end of the bar nearest the door, which was a choice he would understand exactly because he was the kind of person who understood exactly those choices. And he came to her without stopping to speak to anyone else. "You should have waited at home," he said. "I don't have a home in Chicago," she said. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," she agreed. "I chose not to do it." He looked at her. There was something moving through his composed exterior that she was getting better at identifying, not through any specific tell, but through the general quality of the air around him, the way weather systems could be read by anyone who spent enough time outside. "Those men," he said. "I don't need to know who they are," she said. "No, but you should know." He stopped, reformulated. "There are parts of my life that are not safe for people to be near." "I know what you are, Caesar." The words landed in the space between them. She hadn't said them before. She had circled and implied and deflected, because naming things made them real, and real things required decisions. But she was tired of managing the distance. "I know exactly what you are," she said again, more quietly. "And I'm still here, at your bar, with your wine." She looked at him. "Figure out what you want to do with that." She picked up her glass and walked toward the main floor, her pulse doing that medically unnecessary thing. And behind her she heard no footsteps following her, and no retreating either. He was simply there, stationary and present, and she could feel the heat of his attention on the back of her neck like a held breath. The call came on a Tuesday at 11 in the morning, on the phone number she only gave to people in the industry. Not a burner, but a number attached to a name that was neither Mia Fontaine nor Amelia Russo. A name that was simply the service. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar. A woman, brisk, clearly reading from something. "There's a game Thursday evening at a private location. You've been requested by name. 50,000 buy-in. The host is requesting your presence specifically." "By which name?" Mia asked. A pause. "Mia Fontaine." She was quiet for a moment. "The host's name?" "Vitali." She sat in the silence of her hotel room. She was still in Chicago, at a hotel whose front desk had stopped asking how long she planned to stay, and looked at the pale winter light coming through the window. "Tell them yes," she said. The location was a penthouse. Not the Aurelius, not the stone building that was his home. Somewhere new. She was driven to a building she recognized as one of the new glass towers near the waterfront, the kind of building that appeared in architecture magazines before the interior was finished. The elevator required a card she was given in the lobby, and it opened directly into the space. The penthouse was the most beautiful room she had ever been in. Not because of the view, though the view was the whole of Chicago spread out below like a lit circuit board, Lake Michigan in the dark beyond. And not because of the furniture or the art, which were extraordinary, but because the room was clearly lived in, not dressed for impression, but inhabited, with the particular density of a space that someone actually needed. Books on every surface, a half-finished glass on the coffee table, a jacket thrown over the arm of a chair with a carelessness that was oddly intimate. There were 7 other people there, none of whom she recognized. A mix of men and women, all radiating the particular quality of significant money and the ease that came with it. They were gathered near the bar at the far end of the room. Caesar emerged from a corridor as she entered. He'd heard the elevator, she understood, because he heard everything. And he was wearing a white shirt with the collar open, which was the first time she'd seen him without a jacket in the controlled environment of his own spaces. The informality of it was surprisingly affecting. It made him look slightly less inevitable. "You came," he said. "You asked," she said. Something in his face shifted infinitesimally. He was pleased, she understood, Not surprised, but pleased, and the distinction was important. The game that evening was poker, Texas Hold'em, which was below Mia's preferred level of complexity, but she played it because he had asked and because there were 6 other people at the table who didn't know she was playing them, not the cards. She won $60,000. But the game was not the event of the evening. The event came after, when the other guests had taken their losses and their minor wins and distributed themselves into coats and goodbyes, and she was left in the penthouse with Caesar and the quiet and the view. "You were testing something," she said. She was standing at the window, looking at the lake. "Was I?" "The other players, you assembled them deliberately, not for a serious game, for an audience." She turned. He was standing in the middle of the room with a glass of water, watching her the way he watched everything, with that full, composed attention that she had concluded was not calculation, but genuine interest, which was somehow more dangerous than calculation. "You wanted to see how I performed with an audience?" "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because I'm considering something," he said, "and I wanted complete information before I offered it." She waited. "I want you to stay in Chicago." The words were simple. He delivered them simply. There was no flourish, no preamble, no careful architecture of persuasion. He said it the way he'd said his name, as a fact being offered. "Permanently," he said. "That's not a gambling proposition," she said. "No, it's a life proposition. I want you in my city, in my circle. I want to see you across tables and at dinners and in the mornings." He paused. "I'm not asking you to stop being what you are. I'm asking you to be what you are in proximity to me." She turned back to the window. The city below was doing what cities did at night, carrying on, indifferent, a million private stories running in parallel beneath its lights. "You know what happens to people close to you," she said. "Yes." "I've been doing research, Caesar. I know about Jenna Loro. I know about the 2 men from the Ricci family who came for your operation in 2021. I know what happened to them." A silence. "Then you know that I'm effective." "I know that you're dangerous," she said. "And I know the difference." She heard him cross the room. Not quickly, not urgently, but with that deliberate, unhurried movement she'd come to recognize as his particular idiom of authority. He stopped close enough behind her that she could feel the warmth of him against the cool from the glass. He didn't touch her. "I have never lost anyone I chose to protect," he said. She closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them and looked at the city. "I don't need protection," she said. "No," he agreed. "That's not what I'm offering." "Then what?" "A partner," he said. "A person. Someone who sees the table the way I see it." He paused, and she heard something shift in his voice. Not vulnerability exactly, but its structural equivalent. Something that cost more than his usual delivery. "In 36 years, I have not met anyone who plays the way you play, who reads a room the way you read it, who," another pause, "sits at my table and makes me feel like the game is worth playing." She turned around. He was closer than she'd thought, close enough that turning brought her face within a breath of his chest before she adjusted. She looked up at him. In the half-dark of the room, in the city's reflected light, he was looking at her with an expression she finally, fully recognized. The same expression she made when she held a hand she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure she deserved. He was afraid, in the particular way of people who were afraid of wanting something. She was aware of the exact distance between them. She was aware of her own heartbeat as a physical, inconvenient, entirely real thing. She was aware of the 7 years of careful isolation, the architecture of independence she'd built around herself, the deliberate choice to need nothing and no one, the operational necessity she'd elevated to a philosophy. "I need to think," she said. "I know," he said. He stepped back. He gave her the room back. He refilled her water glass and they talked about the Morandi still life in the corridor of his house for 20 minutes, and she left at midnight. And in the car on the way back to her hotel, she sat in the dark with her hand pressed flat against her sternum and tried to decide whether the feeling in her chest was warning or welcome. She couldn't tell. She suspected, which was the most alarming thing, that it might be both. 2 days after the penthouse evening, a man named Tony Calabrese arrived in Chicago. Mia knew Tony Calabrese the way she knew most people who occupied the margins of the world she worked in. Not personally, but by reputation, by the stories that circulated among the small professional class of people who did what she did. Tony was not a gambler. He was a facilitator, a broker of access, the kind of man who moved between rooms where things were decided and extracted his commission in information. He was also, according to the intelligence she'd assembled over her years in the work, occasionally employed by people who needed to know where someone was. He called her at noon on a Wednesday. "You've been in Chicago a while," he said, in the way people said things that weren't observations but questions. "Have I?" she said. "There's some interest in your current activities," Tony said, "from some people who would prefer you to be active in a different city, or not active at all." "Which people?" A pause. "The Rennet Group." She was quiet. The Rennet Group was not a group in any formal sense. It was the informal designation given to the combined interests of 3 casino operators whose establishments she had, over the preceding 3 years, relieved of approximately $2 million. They were not the kind of people who took losses philosophically. "They know where I am?" she asked. "They're working on it," Tony said, and the distinction between know and working on it was meant to be reassuring, but wasn't. "My strong advice would be to conclude your business in Chicago and relocate. Quickly." She hung up. For 40 minutes, she sat in her hotel room and ran through the architecture of her problem. The Rennet Group had reach, but not unlimited reach. In most cities, she had enough distance and enough cover that they couldn't locate her with the speed that mattered. But in Chicago, if they had a trail, and she'd been in Chicago long enough to have created a trail, she'd been careless, a word she never applied to herself, and that sat in her brain now with the weight of an accusation. In Chicago, the calculation was different. And in Chicago, she had become, without fully deciding to, entangled with a man whose own landscape of enemies was already complex enough. She picked up her phone. She had Caesar's number. He'd given it to her on the 3rd visit, written on a small card that she'd put in the inner pocket of her jacket and never transferred to her phone, as though keeping it in analog kept the choice in suspension. Now she typed it in. He answered on the 2nd ring. "There's a problem," she said. "Tell me." She told him, efficiently, without embellishment, the way she reported everything, facts, timeline, probable vectors. 3 minutes. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "Are you at your hotel?" he said. "Yes." "Don't leave. I'm sending someone." Then, "Are you all right?" The question was so simple and so direct that she almost couldn't answer it. Not because it frightened her, but because it was the kind of question she hadn't been asked in a very long time, and the muscle required to receive it had atrophied somewhere in the years of working alone. "Yes," she said, "I'm fine." "I know you're fine," he said. "I asked if you're all right." The distinction, fine, all right, was precise and intentional. She understood what he was asking. He was asking whether the news had frightened her or only activated her. He was asking after the thing underneath the operational response. "Ask me later," she said. "I will," he said, and hung up. A man arrived within the hour, not the broad-shouldered one who delivered the envelope, but a younger man, compact and quiet, who identified himself as Marco, which was either his name or his cover name, both possibilities equally plausible. He moved her to a car, and the car moved her across the city to a building she hadn't been to before. A residential property, a brownstone on a quiet street, clean and comfortable and clearly maintained for exactly this kind of contingency. Caesar arrived 3 hours later. He came through the door of the brownstone with his jacket still on and his phone in his hand, and the focused, efficient energy of someone in the middle of several things. He looked at her, where she was sitting on the leather sofa with a cup of coffee, and the first thing he did was stop moving entirely and simply look at her, the way you looked at something you'd been worried about and were relieved to find intact. Then he sat across from her and told her what he'd done. The Rennet Group has 2 people in Chicago. I know who they are. They've been... He paused, and the pause was the gap between what he was willing to say and what had actually occurred. Encouraged to relocate. Encouraged, she said. Permanently discouraged from Chicago specifically, and from any interest in your activities. He held her gaze. I need you to understand something. Go ahead. I didn't do that because you're a guest. I did that because you matter to me. He said it with the same directness with which he said everything, and it landed with the same force. That may create complications for you. You didn't ask for it. If you object to it, I need to know. She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of everything in the room, the quality of the light, the smell of coffee and old wood, the sound of traffic muted by the walls, the silence between them that was dense and attentive. I don't object, she said. Something released in his face. Not dramatically. There was no drama in Caesar Vitali's face, but the way a drawn muscle releases when held tension is no longer needed. Thank you, he said, for not objecting to you protecting me, for telling me honestly. He set his phone down on the table between them. I have a great deal of practice with people who tell me what they calculate I need to hear. You don't do that. I find it, another of his precise pauses, rare. I find it efficient, she said. Yes, that too. He stayed that evening. She understood this precisely because precision was her native language, in the way that required any redefinition of what they were to each other. He stayed because the situation required monitoring, and because he was a man who, having determined that something mattered to him, kept it where he could see it. They ate takeout from a place around the corner that appeared to be a very good Italian restaurant operating under the most prosaic possible facade. They drank good wine from a case that was already in the brownstone, which told her it was genuinely his safe house and not a commandeered property. They talked for 4 hours, about her years working alone, about the architecture of the cons she ran, about what it felt like to be the most intelligent person in a room and have to pretend otherwise, about his father's transition from the old family way of operating to the new, and what had been lost and what had been clarified. She told him about New Orleans, about her mother, who had been a card player of the intuitive variety, who had played kitchen table games with neighbors and known by some unteachable sense when to hold and when to give up, who had died of a thing that had nothing to do with any of this when Mia was 19. He listened without filling the silences. At midnight, she fell asleep on the sofa, which was not what she'd intended, and when she woke at 4 a.m, she was covered by a blanket that had not been there, and he was not in the room. She found a glass of water on the table beside her head and a note in the angular handwriting she knew. Back at 7. Don't leave. She lay back down and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the fact that she hadn't asked anyone to take care of her in a decade, and it had happened anyway, without request, without negotiation, the way weather happened, because it was that kind of day. She slept until 7. He came back at 6:58. She was already dressed and had made coffee, and was standing at the window of the brownstone looking at the street, where morning was performing its usual slow assembly of light and people and sound. She heard his key in the door and turned, not because she was expecting him, but because her body had developed, without asking her permission, the reflex of orienting toward him when he entered a room. He was carrying 2 paper bags and a newspaper he hadn't read, which he set on the table with the bags. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light was doing something generous to the line of his jaw. "You slept," he said. "You noticed. I checked at 3. You were—" He didn't finish the sentence, simply handed her a coffee from the bag. "There's a brioche from the place on the corner, the one that's been there since 1987 and has never bothered to update the sign." She accepted the coffee. She accepted the brioche. She sat at the table and ate it, and he sat across from her and did the same. And neither of them spoke for several minutes, which was the most companionable silence she had experienced since her mother's kitchen, and the recognition of that hit her somewhere unprepared. "I want to make you an offer," he said, eventually. She looked up. "A formal one. A wager." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "A single game, played once, with clearly defined stakes. A week from now. Whatever format you choose." "What are the stakes?" He looked at her steadily. "If you win, you leave Chicago with $2 million. Clean. Untraceable. The Rennet Group situation is resolved permanently. You walk away from all of it. From me, from this. With everything you came here to get and more." She was very still. "If you lose," he said, "you stay. Not as—" He paused, finding the right language with care. "Not as anything you haven't chosen. But you stay. You give Chicago, and me, a real chance." The room was quiet. "You're offering me a wager," she said, "where one outcome is freedom and the other is a relationship." "I'm offering you a wager where one outcome is what you thought you wanted before you came here," he said, "and the other is what I believe you might want now." "That's presumptuous." "It is," he agreed. "I've been told it's one of my less charming qualities." "By whom?" "Everyone who's known me long enough to be honest about it." She stood up, walked to the window, walked back, sat down again. He watched this without comment. "Why a wager?" she asked. "Because it's the language you trust," he said. "Conversations can be managed, declarations can be doubted, but a game has rules, and rules create a kind of truth that you understand better than any other kind." He held her gaze. "I'm not trapping you, Mia. I'm giving you a mechanism you respect. You could just ask me to stay." "I could," he said, "but you would say you need time, and you would leave Chicago, and the trail of you would get cold and then disappear, the way trails do." Something moved through his voice, not desperation, but its elegant, compressed cousin. "I know how you operate. You don't stay anywhere long enough to be found if you decide not to be found." She looked at him. He was right, and they both knew it, and the honesty of his knowing it was the most effective thing he'd done in the whole conversation. "I choose the game," she said. "Yes." "I choose the rules." "Yes." "And I play to win," she said. "I don't throw games, not for anyone." "I know," he said. "If I thought otherwise, I wouldn't be making the offer." She pressed her palm flat on the table between them. He looked at her hand, then at her face. "1 week," she said. 1 week. She picked up her brioche and ate it. He drank his coffee. The morning continued its assembly outside, indifferent and certain, and inside the brownstone, the terms of the most important wager of her life settled between them like a signed contract. The week was the strangest of her life. She stayed in Chicago, at the brownstone, because it made logistical sense, and because the hotel had started to feel transactional in a way that the brownstone, with its case of good wine and its blanket on the sofa, did not. She did not return to her work. She did not reach out to any of her contacts. She suspended, for 7 days, the entire architecture of her operational life, and lived inside the specific and disorienting experience of being simply somewhere. Caesar was present and not present, in the particular way of a person who understood the value of space. He came by in the evenings. He took her to dinner at places that were not the Aurelius, that were not associated with any part of his professional life. A small Vietnamese restaurant in Pilsen, where the owner seemed to know him by a different name. a jazz bar on the north side where he ordered bourbon and didn't talk during the music, a gallery opening for a painter she'd never heard of, whose work was strange and structural and very good. He showed her the city the way someone showed a city they loved, not the famous things, but the private ones. The 1920s theater he'd bought and restored and let rent for $1 a year to a community arts group. The stretch of the river where the light hit a specific way in the late afternoon that he seemed to need to check on personally. The rooftop of a building he owned where, on a clear day, you could see across the lake to a curvature of water that suggested the horizon was not a fixed thing. She watched him. She catalogued him. She ran all of it through the part of her brain that was still, always, assessing. What she assembled was this. Caesar Vitali was a dangerous man who had done things she would never fully know the details of, and who would do them again if required. He was also a man who had built something genuine inside the dangerous thing, something that cared about the theater, and the river, and the light on the water, and the old stone columns in the Aurelius that had earned their weight, who had his grandmother's food at dinner on Sunday, even when there was no grandmother, because the continuity of the thing mattered, who looked at her, specifically, precisely, with individual attention, the way she had spent her adult life ensuring that no one looked at her, because being seen clearly was the professional liability above all others. The night before the game, they were on the rooftop. The cold was serious, but not serious enough to be inside. She was wearing his jacket, which had happened gradually and without announcement, the way several things with him happened, incrementally, without drama, until she looked down and noticed that she was wearing his jacket on a rooftop in Chicago at 11 at night and feeling, against all operational precedent, exactly where she was supposed to be. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She knew he didn't mean of the game. "Ask me again tomorrow," she said. He looked out at the water. "What will the game be?" She'd been thinking about it for a week. She had considered and rejected 6 formats. "Baccarat," she said. "Single hand. Player versus banker. No outside play, no other participants. One hand." "Decisive," he said. "Yes." "And what's your read?" he asked. "What do you think will happen?" She turned to look at him. He was in profile, looking at the lake, and the city light did its best work on his face, and she let herself look at him the way she'd been careful not to look for weeks, fully, without calculation, without the protective filter of assessment. "I think," she said, slowly, "that I'm going to win." He turned to meet her eyes. "I think," she said, "that I have never once in my life lost a game that I genuinely tried to win." "I know," he said. "And I think," she said, "that I don't know anymore whether winning is what I want." The wind moved between them. The lake glittered. Below, the city ran its million private stories. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. The first time he had touched her. The first time in the weeks of proximity and charged silences and careful non-contact. And the touch was so specific and so light that it was somehow the most impactful thing that had occurred between them. His hand dropped. "Play your best game," he said. "That's all I want. Play the best game you're capable of." She held that, turning it over. "Why?" she asked. "Because whatever happens," he said, "I want you to make the choice that's real." She couldn't sleep. This was not unusual for her. She had the sleep schedule of someone who had spent years in environments where sleep required vigilance rather than relaxation, who had trained herself to drop into brief, efficient rest periods, the way a soldier dropped into cover. But the sleeplessness of this night was different. It wasn't the alert, functional wakefulness of operational preparation. It was the raw, restless consciousness of someone who was sitting with something they couldn't resolve. At 2 a.m, she got up and made tea, an inheritance from her mother, who had believed firmly that any problem that couldn't be improved by tea was a problem that couldn't be improved. And she sat at the kitchen table of the brownstone with her tea and her thoughts and the particular weight of a choice she was in the process of making without entirely choosing to make it. She thought about the architecture of her life before Chicago. She had built it carefully, over years, according to a set of principles she developed through trial and error and one or two expensive mistakes. Independence above all, attachment as liability. Beauty and pleasure were allowable. She liked fine things, enjoyed them, extracted genuine enjoyment from the textures and tastes and aesthetics of the world she moved through. But they were enjoyed with the understanding that they were temporary, that she was passing through. She had compared herself, privately, to certain birds that were beautiful precisely because they never landed. She had believed this was a kind of freedom. Sitting in the brownstone kitchen at 2 a.m, she applied the rigorous honesty she brought to card tables and found, unhappily, that she was no longer certain. Because freedom, she was being forced to acknowledge, was different from solitude, and she had been conflating the two with the comfortable self-deception of someone who didn't want to examine the distinction. Her mother had been alone at the end. Not unloved. Mia had been there, had been present, had been as present as a 19-year-old could be while managing the enormous shock of watching someone who was supposed to be permanent become suddenly temporary. But her mother had been alone in the sense that mattered. No partner, no person who had known her long enough to carry her history, no one who understood the full architecture of who she'd been before the illness had simplified it. Mia had told herself she didn't want that kind of partner-shaped entanglement. She had told herself this so many times and in so many formulations that it had become the kind of belief that felt like fact. Caesar Vitali, sitting across a baccarat table with his composed dark eyes and his grandmother's pasta and his rooftop view of Lake Michigan, was the most destabilizing argument against that belief she'd ever encountered. She thought about the wager, $2 million clean, or a chance at something she didn't have a word for yet. The rational calculation was obvious. Take the money, take the freedom, maintain the architecture she'd spent a decade building. The rational calculation was so obvious that the part of her brain that dealt with tells and deceptions and the concealed logic of human behavior was looking at it with deep suspicion. Rational calculations that felt too clean were usually being generated by something that had already made an emotional decision and was constructing a logical justification after the fact. She thought about the way he'd said, "Play your best game. That's all I want." She turned it over in her mind the way you turned a coin, looking at both sides. Play your best game. He wasn't asking her to lose. He had specifically and explicitly asked her not to throw the game. He had said, make the choice that's real, which was either a man who genuinely wanted the outcome to be real, wanted her to stay only if staying was her genuine choice, not a manipulation of circumstance, or it was the most sophisticated version of a con she'd ever encountered. She sat with that possibility for 20 minutes. She was one of the finest readers of human behavior she'd ever met. She applied everything she had to the question, is Caesar Vitali running a con on me? The answer she arrived at was no. Because cons required self-concealment, and Caesar Vitali was the most consistently self-revealing person she had encountered. He said what he meant. He showed what he felt, in the precise and compressed way of someone who felt things deeply and expressed them economically. There was no gap between the presented surface and the interior, or at least, there was no gap she could find, and she was very good at finding gaps. What there was, instead, was a man who had spent his life in a world that required him to project certainty, who had assembled all the architecture of that certainty very effectively, but who had let her see, not by accident she believed, that underneath the architecture was something less certain. A man who had been lonely in the way that very powerful, very contained people were lonely, not from a lack of people, but from a lack of anyone who could see them. She was, she understood at approximately 3:15 in the morning, the first person who had ever read Caesar Vitali clearly. And she understood, with the precision that only came from complete honesty, that this was what he wanted to keep near him. Not her skills at the table, not her beauty, not even the specific combination of intelligence and boldness that had caught his attention. He wanted someone who saw him. She held the weight of that. She felt, somewhere in the architecture of her carefully maintained independence, something shift, not collapse, but shift. The way the foundation of a building doesn't fail, but rather settles into new ground. At 4:15, she finished her tea, washed the cup, went back to bed, and slept for 3 hours without interruption. In the morning, she dressed carefully. Not in the burgundy dress, that was for other games. She chose black, simply cut, with the white gold bracelet on her wrist. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for exactly 3 seconds, the way she looked at any room she was about to enter. She was ready. The question that remained, the one she would not resolve until the cards were in her hands, was what ready meant in the context of a game where she wasn't certain what winning looked like. The Aurelius at 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening was in full operation, and the sound of it, the low roar of money and conversation, and the particular music of a room full of people engaged in the beautiful delusion that skill and luck could be separated, was something she felt in her breastbone as she walked through the door. She was greeted at the entrance by a woman she hadn't met before, tall, beautiful in a composed Mediterranean way, with the bearing of someone who ran things. She identified herself as Sophia. "Mr. Vitali is in the back room," Sophia said, and led her without further preamble. The back room had been rearranged. The poker table was gone. The baccarat table had been moved to the center, and the chairs arranged with the intimacy of a two-person setup. 2 seats facing each other across the green felt, the shoe at the center, the standard baccarat layout with its clean geometry. The dealer, the same young man she'd noted on her first visit, with his quality of stillness, stood at the head of the table. The room held 3 other people along its walls. Marco, the compact, quiet man, a woman she didn't recognize, and a man in his 70s, with the bearing of someone who had once been the most dangerous person in any room he entered, and had retained the posture, if not the current capability. She understood, from the weight of his presence, and from the way everyone in the room arranged themselves slightly relative to him, that this was Marco Vitali, Caesar's father. She filed that information, reassessed the room's architecture, adjusted. Caesar came in from a side door. He was in black, a dark suit, darker shirt, no tie. He looked, she thought, exactly as he always looked, contained, composed, and watching her with a quality of attention that she had come to understand was the fullest version of what most people did with their eyes. "You look," he said, and stopped. He didn't finish the sentence, which was more affecting than any adjective he might have chosen. "Let's play," she said. They sat. The dealer performed the standard shuffle and cut. Mia touched the shoe, a ritual she'd performed at every table she'd ever played. Not for luck, which she didn't believe in, but for orientation, to feel the physical reality of the object and make it specific rather than abstract. The rules of baccarat were simple. They would each bet on either player or banker, and the hand with the highest count closest to 9 took the round. A single hand, 1 dealing cycle, no more. "Banker or player?" the dealer asked. This was the moment. She looked at the table. She looked at the shoe. She looked briefly at Caesar's father along the wall, who was looking at her with the focused assessment of a man who had been making judgments about people for 50 years. Then she looked at Caesar. He was watching her without urgency, without the particular held-breath quality of someone who needed something to go their way. He looked, she thought, at peace with however this resolved, and she knew that the peace was real. She would have seen the inauthenticity if it were performed. He had meant what he said. "Play your best game." "Player," she said. Caesar said, "Banker." The dealer drew the first card for the player position, a 7 of hearts. The second card went to the banker, a 3 of diamonds. Player showed a partial count of 7. Banker showed 3. Third card for the player, a 2 of spades. Total, 9. The highest possible hand, a natural. The dealer drew the fourth card for the banker position, a 6 of clubs. Total, 9. A tie. For 2 full seconds, no one in the room moved or spoke. The dealer looked at the hands with the professional neutrality of someone who had been told to show no expression and was succeeding. Marco Vitali, along the wall, made a sound that was not a laugh and not quite anything else. Then the dealer said, "In the event of a tie, the house rules require a second hand." Mia looked at Caesar. He was looking at the tied hands on the table with an expression that was, she spent a long moment reading it, completely unfeigned surprise. The tile had not been planned. Something in the precise geometry of that expression told her that entirely clearly. "Agreed," she said. "Agreed," Caesar said. The dealer reshuffled. Cut. Drew again. Player, a 4. Banker, a king. Worth 0. Player, a 3. Total, 7. Banker, a 9. Total, 9. The banker won. The room was very quiet. Mia sat in that quiet and looked at the 9 and the king on the felt, and felt in her chest the particular sensation she had expected and yet had not been entirely prepared for. A falling, and then, immediately below the falling, catching her before she hit anything. Relief. She had played her best game. She had said player. She had held with 9 on the first hand. She had played correctly on the second hand, and lost to a banker 9, because the cards fell the way cards fell. She had not thrown it. She had lost. Caesar was looking at her. "Well," she said, after a moment. "Well," he said. She became aware that the room was watching them. The dealer with his professional stillness, Marco Vitali with his 50 years of assessment, Marco and the unknown woman with their precise alertness. She became aware of her own heartbeat, which was doing nothing medically unnecessary. It was simply beating, steadily, the way her mother's heart had beat, until it didn't. "The terms," she said. "As stated." "As stated," he agreed. She stood. She straightened the bracelet on her wrist. She looked at him across the baccarat table, with its 9 and its king and its 0, and said, "I'll need my things from the hotel." Something happened in his face. Not the compressed, not quite smile she'd catalogued. Something larger. Something that his face didn't know what to do with. That was the way she'd describe it later. Like a room that had been dark for a long time, and the light was now on, and it was having to get used to itself. "Marco," he said, without looking away from her. "We'll see to it." She nodded once. She looked at his father, who was looking back at her, with an expression she would spend some time thinking about. Something between evaluation and recognition, as though he were seeing something he'd been waiting to see for a long time. She walked out of the back room into the main floor of the Aurelius, into the noise and light of other people's games, and she stood for a moment in the middle of it all and thought, this is what losing feels like. It felt, entirely and astonishingly, like something she'd been moving toward for years. The days immediately following the game were strange in the way of all transitions. The time when one form of life has ended and the new form hasn't yet found its shape. She moved from the brownstone to a suite at the building he kept near the Aurelius. Not the penthouse, which was his, but the floor below, which was furnished with the same care and had the same quality of light and the same books on the shelves, which he thought was not coincidence. She told no one. She had very few people to tell. The functional contacts of her working life, a handful of people who existed in the same margins she did, and who communicated in the careful, oblique language of people who tracked each other from a distance. She composed a brief message to her most reliable contact, a woman named Devra, who operated as an intermediary and who had been the first person to tell Mia about the Aurelius. Going quiet for a while. All well. Devra responded within an hour. Knew it was coming. Good luck. She had not, Mia thought, known it was coming. But Devra read people the same way Mia did, and perhaps, from the outside, the trajectory had been clearer than from inside. She spent the first 3 days getting oriented, learning the building, the staff, the rhythms. She had a gift for this kind of rapid integration, moving into unfamiliar environments and finding their logic, understanding the hierarchy and the geography and the unspoken rules. It was the same skill set that made her effective at tables, applied to the domestic sphere. Caesar gave her space, with the same understanding of proportion he applied to everything. He was present in the evenings. He showed up with wine and with the information she needed, practical things, logistics, introductions. And he sat across from her at the dining table of the suite, and they talked, and the talking was good, and she found that the peculiar electricity of their early conversations had not dissipated with the resolution of the wager. If anything, it had deepened, having been given permission by the game's outcome to be what it actually was, which was two people who interested each other profoundly and didn't want to stop. On the 4th day, she went to the Aurelius with him for the morning walkthrough, a daily ritual he did, she discovered, before the club opened, moving through the space with the attention of a musician checking the tuning of an instrument. She walked beside him and asked questions, and he answered them with the assumption that she was going to be there long enough for the answers to be useful, which was itself a form of argument for staying. "The man from the back room," she said, as they passed the baccarat table. "Your father." "Yes." "He was there to see the game." "Yes," Caesar said, in a tone that suggested this was both obvious and not the whole of what she'd asked. "What did he think?" Caesar considered. They moved past the bar toward the far end of the room, where the windows were uncovered and the morning light came in flat and honest. "He thinks you're dangerous," he said. "He means it as a compliment." "And your opinion of his opinion?" "I've been trying for 15 years to manage his opinions about my personal life," Caesar said. "I've stopped. His assessment of you is his. Mine is different and more complete." "What's yours?" He stopped walking. He turned to look at her with the full version of his attention, which she still found, even having catalogued it, having studied it, having had it directed at her across multiple tables and dinners and late nights on rooftops, something she had to settle into rather than take in all at once. "You are the most interesting and most complicated thing in my life," he said. "You make me reconsider decisions I was certain about. You see parts of me that I worked hard to make invisible." A pause. "You also cleaned out 3 of my best regular players last month, and I'm choosing to interpret that as a quality." She laughed. He watched the laugh the way he watched everything, with the focused pleasure of someone who was never going to take something for granted. "There are things you need to know," he said, when the laugh had settled. "About the operation, about the family, about the people who are connected to this and the people who are not, and how to tell the difference." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to be part of any of it. I'm asking you to understand it well enough to be safe in proximity to it." "I can handle a briefing," she said. "I know. I'm telling you it will be comprehensive and not entirely comfortable." "Have I given you any indication that I'm uncomfortable with complex information?" "No," he said. "You've given me every indication that you'd be annoyed if I withheld it." "Correct," she said. The briefing, which happened that evening in the penthouse with a bottle of serious Barolo and a stack of documents that were not the kind of thing filing cabinets held, was comprehensive. He told her about the structure of the operation, the legitimate pieces, the clubs, the hotel stakes, the vineyard, and the less legitimate, the logistics network, the financial structures, the relationships with several families whose names she recognized. He told her about the current threats, the alliances that held, the alliances that required maintenance. He told her about the Ricci family incident she'd referenced in their earlier conversation. He was precise and without self-justification about what had happened, which she had not expected, and which she found, in the context of a world she'd always navigated from the outside, something closer to moral clarity than anything else available. She asked questions. He answered them. They finished the wine and started a second bottle, and at some point the documents were on the coffee table, and they were on the sofa, not quite touching, and the conversation had shifted from operational briefing to something more personal, more layered, more about the architecture of who they both were and how they'd become it. She talked about the years between her mother's death and the first table, the year of working ordinary jobs in New Orleans, feeling the particular suffocation of a life that wasn't going to accommodate what she actually was. The first time she'd sat across from a serious player and felt the recognition. This is the game. This is the intelligence. This is the work that fits the shape of what I can do. He talked about his father, not with the practiced diplomacy of family loyalty, but with the specific, complicated honesty of a son who had exceeded his father and loved him and couldn't always separate the two. A father who had built the family through force of will and specific kinds of ruthlessness, who had handed it to a son who had more patience and more intelligence and a different vision of what it was for, and who had never quite forgiven the son for making it into something he didn't entirely recognize. "He loves you," she said. "Yes," Caesar said, "in the way that powerful men love their sons, which is not a small love, but it comes with conditions." "And you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I learned to love him the way I learned to play cards, by understanding the rules he operated by, and respecting them, even when I didn't agree with them." She looked at him. "That's the saddest thing you've said." He turned to look at her, and she saw, for a brief and unguarded moment, the full weight of what she'd identified, the specific loneliness of the most capable person in the room. Then he said, "It's better now." And she understood, without him saying it, that he meant her. The first real test came 3 weeks after the game, in the form of a man named Eduardo. Eduardo Mancini was 32, handsome in a way that led with itself, and had grown up in the same neighborhood as Caesar's father. He was the son of a family that had been allied with the Vitalis for 30 years, and he ran a piece of the logistics operation in the northeastern corridor, a position he held primarily because of the alliance and secondarily because of competence, which Mia assessed within the first hour of meeting him as somewhat limited. He arrived at the Aurelius on a Tuesday evening with 3 men and a woman, and the easy confidence of someone who had never been required to compete for the authority he held. He was introduced to Mia with the formality appropriate to someone Caesar had integrated into his inner circle, and Eduardo looked at her in the way Mia had been looked at by men for her entire adult life, a look that assessed and categorized before the assessment was complete, that decided what she was before it finished looking. "Fontaine," he said, as though testing the name. "You're the card player." "Among other things," she said. "Caesar's keeping you around," he said. The phrasing was deliberate, the keeping, the lack of any more specific designation. He was communicating a position before she'd established one. "I'm here," she said, "which is different." He smiled. It was a smile that was used to working. "You're brave," he said. "I'll give you that. Coming into this world," he gestured with his drink, indicating something beyond the club walls. "Without a name, without a family, relying on, what? A winning streak at the table?" "My losses are as useful as my wins," she said. "More useful sometimes. You learn more from the situations that don't go the way you planned." "Is that right?" "Ask Caesar about the Aurelius's take on Saturday evening since I arrived," she said. "I've redirected more revenue in 3 weeks than the previous model did in a quarter." Eduardo looked at her for a long moment. The smile didn't leave, but the quality of it changed. It stopped being dismissive and became something more attentive, which was a more honest position, but also a more wary one. "Smart girl," he said. Woman, she said, without heat, without emphasis, simply as a correction. He held her gaze for another moment, then moved away toward the bar with the practiced ease of someone who had decided to postpone rather than resolve. Caesar, she noted, had been aware of the entire exchange from across the room. He came to her when Eduardo had moved away, and he stood beside her with a particular proximity that was not quite touching, but communicated clearly that she was in his domain. "Eduardo," she said. "Yes," he said. "Is he going to be a problem?" "He's going to try," Caesar said. "He's been trying since I told him there was someone new in the circle." A pause. "He's not someone you need to manage. I'll manage him." "I can manage him myself," she said. "I know," he said, "but you shouldn't have to." She looked at him. There was something in his tone, not territorial, not possessive in the simple sense, but protective in a way that was different from what she'd experienced from the men who'd occasionally tried to protect her over the years. Those men had protected her from a position that assumed her incapacity. This was something else. This was a man who was fully aware of her capacity and was offering to take on the particular kind of friction she shouldn't be required to navigate on his behalf. "Don't make me invisible," she said. "In the process of protecting me, don't make me invisible." He turned to face her fully. "The last thing I would ever do," he said. She believed him. Later that evening, she overheard, or rather, precisely positioned herself to overhear, because there was a difference, a conversation between Eduardo and one of his men in the corridor outside the main floor. The gist of it: Eduardo was speculating about her actual relationship with Caesar, and the speculation was not charitable. He was wondering, to his companion, how long she'd last. He was wondering whether she was an asset or a liability to the operation. He was using words she'd heard used about women in rooms like this before, and they were not, she observed clinically, words that suggested Eduardo Mancini had ever been required to take a woman seriously in a professional context. She walked into the corridor. Both men looked at her. Eduardo's face did the thing faces did when they were caught doing something they knew was wrong. A brief flicker of calculation, then the return of the smile. "We were just," he started. "I know what you were," she said. "Here's what I want you to know." She stood in the middle of the corridor with her arms at her sides and looked at him with the expression she used at tables when she wanted someone to understand that she saw exactly what they were holding. "I don't need Caesar to manage you. I don't need anyone to manage you. I'm telling you now, directly, because I prefer direct. I'm here. I'm going to be here. And my presence in this operation is going to be beneficial to you in ways you haven't considered yet, if you're smart enough to allow it to be." A pause. "Are you?" Eduardo looked at her for a long moment. "I'm listening," he said. "Good." She turned and walked back to the main floor. Caesar was standing at the bar with a glass of water, looking at her in the way she had come to love, the focused, full attention of someone who was perpetually, genuinely interested. "Did you manage him?" he said. "I propose the détente," she said. "We'll see if he's sensible enough to take it." "And if he's not?" "Then you can manage him," she said, "but give him a chance to be sensible first." He handed her a glass of wine. "I told you were remarkable." "You told me watching me work was remarkable," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She looked at him. He was looking at her. The bar noise moved around them like weather. "No," she said. "Actually, not anymore." In February, he took her to Italy. Not formally, not with the weight of a declared significant event. He mentioned it on a Thursday evening. He had business at the vineyard. Would she come? She said yes the way she'd said yes to dinner on the first invitation, because she wanted to, and had stopped pretending otherwise. The vineyard was in the hills south of Siena, in a landscape so explicitly beautiful that it felt like an accusation. The property had been in his mother's family for 4 generations, a farmhouse of stone and terracotta tile, expanded carefully over the decades, Surrounded by vineyards on 3 sides and a view of the valley on the 4th, they'd went for 30 kilometers on a clear day. His grandmother's grave was in a small garden behind the main house. He went there on the first morning, alone, with flowers he'd brought from the village. She watched from the window and understood that she was seeing something private, something he wasn't concealing from her, but wasn't performing for her either. She stayed at the window until he came back inside. "She would have wanted to meet you," he said. He said it as a statement of fact, not sentiment. "You said she would have liked me," Mia said. Both things are true. They worked, each of them, in their own ways. He met with the vineyard manager, walked the rows, tasted from barrels, had long conversations in rapid Italian that she followed with 50% comprehension and total attentiveness, learning the cadence of him in his mother tongue. She walked every morning for 2 hours through the hills, learning the shape of the place, thinking about things she'd stopped letting herself think about in the years of forward motion. On the 3rd evening, sitting on the terrace with the valley going amber and purple below them and a bottle of the estate Sangiovese between them, she said, "My real name isn't Mia Fontaine." He looked at her. He wasn't surprised, she could see. He had known there was a constructed identity. She'd never suggested otherwise. But the gesture of the disclosure registered. Something in his posture received it. "Amelia Grace Russo," she said. "Mia was my mother's name for me. I took Fontaine from her maiden name." She picked up her wineglass. "I'm from New Orleans. My father left when I was 7. My mother raised me alone, and did it well. She died when I was 19, of a cardiac event that the doctor said was rare for her age, and that I have spent 10 years not thinking about." She paused. "That's the architecture." He was quiet for a moment. "Russo," he said. "Amelia." "Mia is real," she said quickly. I'm not asking you to call me something else. I'm asking you to know it." "I know it," he said. The valley went on, going amber below them. "My name," he said after a while, "is not a construction. But there are things I've done under it that are not what I would have chosen if I'd started differently." He turned his wineglass in his hand. "I've made peace with most of it. There are 2 things I haven't." "Tell me one." A silence. A serious one. "A man died in 2019 who didn't need to," he said. "He was connected to a situation that required resolution, and the resolution was performed by someone I trusted who had less restraint than the situation required. I could have prevented it. I didn't move quickly enough." He said it without absolution seeking, without the particular quality of confession that wanted to be forgiven. He said it as a fact he carried. "And the second?" she asked. "The second I'm still in the middle of. Give me time." She looked at him. The scar below his left ear was visible in the low terrace light, and she thought, not for the first time, that it was the most honest thing about him, the mark of a moment when the world had been able to reach him. She reached out and touched it, the tip of her fingers, light, the same way he'd tucked her hair back on the rooftop. He went very still. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. She dropped her hand. He turned to look at her fully, and in the evening light of his family's hill in Tuscany, with the Sangiovese between them and the valley going dark below, he looked at her with an expression she recognized now, the held-breath fear of wanting something and the extraordinary difficulty of letting yourself have it. "Come here," she said. He leaned toward her, and she put her hands on either side of his face, and she kissed him. And he kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything. Fully, precisely, with the total commitment of someone who didn't do anything he didn't mean. And the valley went on going dark around them, indifferent and beautiful, as valleys did. Later, in the farmhouse, in the room with the stone walls and the view she'd been told about and that exceeded telling, she lay in the dark and listened to him breathe beside her and thought, "This is the thing I didn't know I was building toward." She was not afraid. She was, which was entirely new, and entirely welcome, at rest. Marco Vitali invited her to lunch on the Thursday after they returned from Italy. Not through Caesar. Through Sophia, who delivered the invitation with the precise neutrality of someone who worked for Caesar but recognized that this particular invitation was on separate authority. The invitation named a restaurant on the north side, not one of Caesar's properties, not one of the Vitalis' known establishments. A small Sicilian place with a hand-lettered sign and a lunch crowd of neighborhood regulars. She went without telling Caesar until afterward. She told him afterward because she wanted to have the conversation first and report it accurately, not because she was concealing it, and he understood the distinction without requiring an explanation. Marco Vitali was already at the table when she arrived. In daylight, outside the controlled environment of the back room, he looked different. Older, thicker, with the specific gravity of a man whose authority had once been absolute and was now more distributed. He was eating bread and drinking sparkling water, and he stood when she approached, which she hadn't expected. "Signorina Fontaine," he said, "or Russo. I understand you gave my son the real name." "I did," she said. "Sit down." She sat. He sat. The waiter brought her water without asking. "I want to understand what you are," he said. "Caesar could tell you." "Caesar would tell me things that were accurate and incomplete," he said. "He edits around what he wants me to think about the people he cares about. He always has." He said this without criticism. It was a statement of knowledge about his son, delivered with the intimacy of long observation. "I want your account." She looked at him. He had Caesar's eyes, the same dark color, the same quality of full attention. But where Caesar's attention was focused and contained, Marco's had the wider angle of a man who had spent decades assessing entire rooms rather than individuals. "I'm a professional gambler," she said. "I've been defrauding casinos and gaming establishments for 7 years. I'm very good at it. I came to the Aurelius with professional intention and left with personal entanglement." She paused. "I have no family connections to any organized crime operation. No allegiances, no outstanding arrangements. I'm a civilian who happens to have been in the room where these things happen for a number of years." "And now?" "Now I'm in a different kind of room," she said. Marco ate a piece of bread. He was considering her with the patience of someone who had learned that the important things said themselves if you let enough silence accumulate. "My son," he said, "has not had..." He paused, finding the word with deliberation. "Attachments that lasted. Not since his 20s. He is a man who is very good at managing everything in his life, except the things that can't be managed." "He managed this one," she said. Marco looked at her. "Did he?" She understood the question. The wager was his, but the outcome was mine. I didn't lose because I was manipulated. I lost because the cards fell the way they fell. And if they'd fallen the other way? I'd have taken the $2 million, she said honestly. And I'd have been in the car on the way to the airport, and I'd have thought about that rooftop for a long time. Marco made the sound she'd heard in the back room, the not laugh, and this time it resolved into something closer to a full expression. "You're honest," he said. "It's more efficient," she said. "Caesar says that," Marco said. "Almost exactly that." He looked at her for a long moment. "He's not easy." "I know. He carries things, old things, from the family, from the work. He carries them without showing them, and the carrying makes him harder to reach than he looks." "I know," she said again. "You read him." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good. He needs someone who can read him." He picked up his water glass. "He also needs someone who won't let him disappear into the work when the work gets dark. He has a talent for that, for making himself only the operation when the personal things become complicated. It's how I raised him, and I have..." He paused. "Some regrets about it." She looked at him. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man who was making a small disclosure that cost him something. "I'll remember that," she said. "Good." He refilled her water glass from the bottle on the table. "I also want to tell you, anyone who comes after you comes through me first. You're in his circle. That means you're in mine." He said it with the matter-of-fact quality of a legal principle being stated, regardless of what you are to each other at any given moment. She held the weight of that. It was, she recognized, the most significant thing he'd said, and he'd said it plainly and without theater. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. It's not a gift, it's a structure. You operate in this world now. Structures protect you whether you appreciate them or not." The food arrived. It was, she noted, the same pasta she'd had on the first night. The same sauce, the same depth. The grandmother's recipe performed in a restaurant by someone who clearly had learned it from the same source. "Your mother's kitchen?" she said. Marco looked up from his plate with an expression she recognized from Caesar's face, the slight, involuntary release of something held. "Who told you?" "The food," she said, "the same as at Caesar's." Something crossed his face that was not sentiment, but its structural presence, the weight of a woman who was gone, and who had cooked the same sauce every Sunday for decades, and whose recipe had outlasted her. "She was the most dangerous person I ever knew," he said after a moment, "and the best." They ate in comfortable silence. 3 months after the game, Mia discovered something. She discovered it accidentally, or in the way that accidents happen to people who are paying attention, not by chance, but by the gradual accumulation of small observations that suddenly formed a pattern she hadn't been looking for. She had been in Caesar's office in the penthouse, using his desk while he was in a meeting on the main floor. She was working through the Aurelius's financial models, a project she'd taken on herself, restructuring the club's revenue allocation in ways that were more efficient and less visible to the kind of attention they didn't want. And she needed a reference document that she'd left in the bottom drawer of his desk. She opened the drawer. The document was there. Under it was a leather notebook, unlatched, which she would not have opened except that it fell open when she moved the document, and the page it opened to was covered in the angular handwriting she knew. It was a record of hands played. Not a gambling log. She recognized the difference. This was more personal than that. Dates, game types, outcomes, and notes. Pages of it, going back years. She wasn't going to read it. She moved to close it, and then her eye caught a date. The date of the game. Their game. She stopped. She read. The entry was dated the night of the wager. The game type was noted. Baccarat, single hand. The outcome was noted. Banker wins. Below the outcome, in smaller writing, was a note that she read 3 times before she understood it. It said, "Drew the 9 deliberately. Second card choice. Could have altered sequence. Chose not to. Final result. Real." She sat very still with the notebook in her hands, and the morning light coming through the penthouse windows, and the city below doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous. Drew the 9 deliberately. She thought about the second hand, the reshuffling after the tie, the precise sequence of draws. She thought about Caesar's hands on the table, the slight forward lean he'd made when the dealer began the second shuffle, that she'd read at the time as attention, and was now reading as something else entirely. She thought about the fact that he was the most skilled card player she'd ever encountered, that he had never lost a game in his life, that she had beaten 11 casinos in 7 years, and had not beaten him in a direct confrontation. She thought about his voice on the morning of the game. "Play your best game. That's all I want." He had lost deliberately. She sat with that for 20 minutes. Then she closed the notebook, replaced it exactly as she'd found it, and went back to the financial models. And she worked until he came back upstairs. And when he came in, she looked at him across the desk, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything. but something in the quality of the silence had changed. That evening, after dinner, she said, "I want to know something." He looked up from the book he was reading. "Ask it." "The second hand," she said. A pause. Not a long one. He held her gaze. "You didn't play your best game," she said. He was quiet. "You could have won the second hand," she said. "You drew a 9. A banker 9 beats a player 7. But you chose the sequence. You engineered the outcome." She looked at him. "Didn't you?" Another silence. He set the book down. "Yes," he said. The word was small and complete and honest. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, the full weight of his attention, the focused dark eyes, the composed face that was not, she saw now, composed at all. It was holding something, had been holding something for months. "Because you came in with the intention of winning," he said, "and leaving. And I watched you across that table, and I thought about what it would mean to win a game that made you walk out that door." His voice was steady. It was the voice of someone saying something that was true and costing them. "And I found that the prospect was..." A pause. "Unacceptable." She looked at him. "I didn't trap you," he said immediately. "I know what I said about the terms, about the real choice. I know what I said about your best game. I was..." He stopped, started again. "I've never in my life made a decision based on what I wanted rather than what was correct. I've always played correctly, always managed correctly. And I sat across from you with the cards in my hands and I made a choice." "You cheated," she said. "Yes," he said. "In a game you designed." "Yes." "Because you wanted me to stay." He looked at her without flinching. "Yes." She stood up, walked to the window, stood there for a moment, looking at the lake, which was doing what it always did, immense and patient, its dark surface working in the city light. Behind her, she heard him stand. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the room, and he looked, for the first time in all the months she'd known him, uncertain. Not afraid of consequences. This was a man who had made peace with consequences, in ways that predated anything she was in a position to create. But uncertain of her, of what she was going to do with the truth, now that she had it. "I was going to leave," she said. "I know." "After the first hand tied, I was going to lose the second on purpose," she said. "I had decided. I wanted to lose. I wanted to stay, and the tie gave me a second chance to make the choice with real cards, and I was going to let the banker hand be the answer I chose." He was very still. "And then I watched your hands," she said, "and I saw you choose the draw, and I played the player hand and lost it fair, because you wanted the outcome to be real, and I wanted it to be real, and neither of us played our best game." She held his gaze. "We both threw it." The room was very quiet. "We both threw it," he said slowly. "Yes." He covered the distance between them in 3 steps, and his hands found her face the way they'd found it on the rooftop, with the same specific, careful touch of someone handling something they were grateful to be permitted to touch. And this time there was no wind, and no careful stepping back, and no giving the room away. "You were going to lose deliberately," he said. "I was," she said. "I was going to lose deliberately, because for the first time in my life, I was more interested in what I'd lose by winning than in what I'd win." He looked at her. He was, she would remember this later, in the years of later that followed, more undone than she'd ever seen him, more present, more available, less architecture between the interior and the exterior. "Two people who can both read a hand perfectly," he said, "and they both threw it." "The cards always knew," she said. He kissed her, and she kissed him back. And outside, the lake went on being the lake, And inside the penthouse, the final bet was settled, not by a nine of clubs or a king of diamonds, but by two people who had spent their entire lives knowing exactly what to do and had each, in the same moment, chosen something entirely different. Word traveled the way word traveled in this world, quietly, through channels that didn't announce themselves, arriving in people's awareness as though it had always been there. Within a month of the game, within the specific social ecosystem of the Vitali operation, it was understood that Mia Fontaine occupied a position that had not previously existed in the structure. Not a girlfriend in the conventional sense. That word was too domestic, too narrow for a woman who was sitting in on logistics reviews and rebuilding the Aurelius's revenue model, and who had, in a single corridor conversation, managed a détente with Eduardo Mancini that had lasted, improbably, 2 months without requiring any maintenance from Caesar. Not a business partner in the formal sense either, though that was closer. She was a presence, a weight, a force that reorganized the room around it when it entered. People who had been with the Vitali operation for 20 years found themselves accounting for her in their calculations. Not because Caesar had positioned her as someone to be accounted for. He had, in his way, but the positioning was more implicit than explicit. But because she was herself accounting for them, with the full force of her particular intelligence. And people who were being accurately read had an instinct, whether they liked it or not, to adjust their behavior accordingly. Eduardo had become, not a friend, but something close to a wary ally. She had kept her promise, had found ways to present his position to Caesar in a more favorable light when the logistics issues in the Northeast came up, had supported one of his proposals that she believed had merit, had been straightforward with him about which of his other proposals did not. He had responded, grudgingly, and then with less grudge, with a professional respect that was more useful than friendship would have been. Sophia, who ran the day-to-day management of the Aurelius with a precision that Mia recognized and admired, had become the person she was most likely to have a direct and honest conversation with about the operation. Sophia had been with Caesar for 8 years, and had the accumulated knowledge of someone who'd watched him handle crises, make decisions, and be consistently the most composed person in the room in situations where composure cost something. She shared this knowledge with Mia in the way of women who recognize in each other the ability to use information responsibly. "He hasn't been like this," Sophia said to her once, obliquely, over a working lunch in the Aurelius kitchen. "Like what?" "Present," Sophia said. "He's always been here, physically, operationally, doing the work. But there was always a part of him that was somewhere else, somewhere back." She paused, considering. "He's not back anywhere right now." Mia understood. She had noticed the same thing. The quality of his attention, which had always been remarkable, had shifted. It was warmer and less armored. Not less focused, but focused differently, on the here rather than the management of the here. She had thought, without saying it, that she had done that being seen clearly had freed him to stop constructing quite so much armor. She held this observation with care, because it was the kind of thing that could make a person careless, and she had not gotten this far by being careless about the things that mattered. The New York visit happened in mid-April. One of the 6 gaming establishments was there, a place in the Flatiron district that operated under the cover of a private hospitality club. He introduced her to the people who ran it, and to the people who moved through it, and she was received with the calibrated attention of people who understood that Caesar had brought her for a reason. The man who ran the New York operation was named Pietro, older, careful, with the build of someone who had spent 20 years in a physical version of the work before moving into management. He tested her in the first hour with a sequence of offhand remarks that were designed to seem casual and were actually calibrated assessments of her knowledge, her alignment, her reliability. She recognized each one and answered each one accurately, and by the 3rd hour, his calibration was complete, and the dynamic had settled into something workable. On their 3rd night in New York, they went to dinner at a restaurant in the West Village that was not affiliated with any of the operation's properties. a place Caesar liked that served food that was not Italian and was very good. At dinner, over a burgundy that was as serious as the Barolo she'd criticized that first night, she said, "I want to keep playing." He looked up. "At the tables," she said. "Not here, not in your operations. Elsewhere. I've been not working for 3 months, and I'm going stir-crazy." She held his gaze. "It's who I am. The work." He was quiet for a moment. Not resistant. She read him well enough now to know the difference between his resistance and his consideration. "The Rennet Group," he said. "Resolved," she said. "You resolved it." "There are others." "There will always be others," she said. "That's not a reason to stop. It's a reason to be smart." She leaned forward. "I'm very good at smart." "I know," he said. "That's not what concerns me." "What concerns you?" "That the work takes you to places where I'm not," he said. He said it with the same plainness he used for everything, without pretense or disguise. "And that those places have their own risks, independent of any specific enemy. That you'd be—" a pause. "Outside my range." "I've been outside anyone's range for 7 years," she said. "I know," he said again. "I find that I have strong feelings about the continuation of that arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. "You can't keep me in a building." "I have no intention of keeping you anywhere," he said. He held her gaze. "I'm telling you my feelings, not my plans. Those are different things. You told me you'd tell me honestly when something affected you. I'm doing the same." She sat with that. "Come with me," she said. "When you can. For the significant ones." Something in his face shifted. The thing she'd started to look for. The movement below the composed surface that happened when she said something that reached him. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." "And when you can't," she said, "I'll call." "Every night," he said. "I want to know where you are, every night." "That's very domestic of you," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "I find that I don't object." She smiled. He looked at the smile with the particular quality of someone for whom the specific texture of someone else's happiness had become necessary. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held it. "Every night," she said. May brought trouble in the way trouble always came. Not announced, not dramatic, but arriving through a sequence of small signals that she'd learned to read, the way she learned to read tables. It started with a call from Marco. He called Caesar, not her, but she was in the penthouse when the call came, and she watched Caesar's face in the 3/4 profile she'd spent months studying. And she saw the thing that was not visible on Caesar's face in any other circumstance. The compression of urgency. The jaw muscle. The specific quality of stillness that was not composure, but controlled response. He hung up and told her, "There's a situation." "How bad?" "Complex." He was already moving. Jacket, phone, the keys to the car he kept in the building garage. "I need you to stay here." "Tell me the situation." He stopped, looked at her. They were in the same dynamic they'd been in before, in the corridor on the night she'd overheard the men's meeting, the tension between his instinct to protect and her expectation to be present. "The Marchetti family," he said. "New York. They have a stake in operations that overlap with ours in a way that's been managed for several years. Something has shifted in their leadership, and there's a push to expand their claim. Into your territory. Into territory that's been understood as ours by mutual agreement since 2018. He was watching her process it. "This is the kind of thing that goes badly in specific ways that require me not to be visible," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the brownstone and the blanket and the note on the table. "I'll stay," she said. He came back to her, 2 steps, deliberate, and held her face the way he held her face when something mattered more than usual, and looked at her with the full version of his attention. "Thank you," he said. Don't thank me, she said. Come back. He pressed his mouth to her forehead, once, brief, and then he was gone. She stayed. She was not idle. She spent the night on the Aurelius financials, then on a separate project she'd started, a restructuring of the logistics network documentation that she'd identified as having significant vulnerability from a regulatory standpoint. By 2 a.m, she had a proposal that would address 3 of the 4 key risks. He called at midnight, as he'd promised. Brief. The situation was active but controlled. He was with his father. He was safe. She believed him and went back to work. The resolution took 4 days. She heard it piecemeal, from Caesar's calls, from Sophia, from Marco, who called her directly on the 3rd day because there was a document that needed cross-referencing with the financial structures she'd been working on, and he needed someone with full access who could be trusted. She did the cross-referencing. She found 2 issues that the document's authors hadn't caught, which she communicated to Marco, who received this information with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to people being either useful or not, and finding this particular person useful. You work well under pressure, he said. I work better under pressure, she said. Caesar is the same, he said. And then, after a pause, he's fine. They all are. It'll be done tomorrow. It was done the day after tomorrow, which was close enough. Caesar came back on a Thursday morning, unchanged in the ways that mattered, carrying the particular quiet weight of someone who had spent 4 days in a high-stakes situation and come out the other side with the outcome he needed. She was at the kitchen table with coffee when he came in. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at her. The proposal you sent, he said. The logistics restructuring. Did it help? It was the clearest piece of analysis I've seen in 5 years of these operations, he said. My father asked me who drafted it. What did you tell him? I told him the truth, he said. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her. He looked exhausted, in the way of people who had not slept properly and had managed enormous things without that sleep. And also, she saw it, the relief of being back, present. She poured him coffee. He took it with both hands and held it, and they sat in the kitchen in the morning light, not speaking, in the specific comfort of 2 people who had been in different difficult places and were now back in the same room. You stayed, he said, after a while. You came back, she said. He reached across the table. She took his hand. I need to tell you the second thing, he said. The thing I said I was still in the middle of, in Italy. She waited. There's a man, he said. His name is Farrar. He's not from any of the families. He's from a different world, corporate, finance, the kind of money that has no history but enormous reach. He's been building a position that would allow him to make a significant hostile move against everything I've built here. A pause. He's been working on it for 2 years. I found out a year ago. I've been dealing with it quietly. The Marchetti situation is connected to Farrar, Caesar said. He's been creating pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Marchetti push was his. She absorbed this. He wants the operation. He wants the legitimate pieces, the clubs, the hotels, the vineyard. He thinks the family associations are a manageable liability, and the assets are worth the complication. Caesar's voice was level. He's not wrong about the asset valuation. He's wrong about his ability to acquire them. How are you dealing with it? Slowly, Caesar said. The way you deal with someone who's smart and patient and well-resourced. You build a stronger position before you engage directly. What do you need? He looked at her. I need you to do what you've been doing, he said. The documentation restructuring, the financial modeling, the Aurelius revenue analysis. Every piece of that makes the operation more legible, more defensible, more clearly mine. She understood. He was asking her to continue doing exactly what she'd been doing, for reasons she'd thought were internal and organizational, but which were, she now saw, also strategic and external. You should have told me earlier, she said. I know, he said. I was managing your exposure. I didn't want you near Farrar before I understood the situation. That's the same instinct we discussed, she said. The making invisible. Yes, he said. I know. I'm telling you now. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the morning light, with the coffee between them and the full complexity of his situation available to her for the first time. Then tell me everything, she said. Every detail, and we'll figure out what to do about Farrar together. He did. The Farrar situation came to a head faster than Caesar had planned. She had spent 3 weeks going through every document, every structure, every corporate entity in the operations organizational chart. It was the most complex analysis she'd ever done, and she'd spent 7 years doing analysis, just of human behavior rather than corporate structures. The same principles applied. Find the patterns, identify the anomalies, understand what the architecture was hiding. What she found was that Farrar had not been building a hostile position from the outside. He had been building it from the inside. He had a silent stake, small enough to be invisible in any individual review, but collectively significant, distributed through 4 separate vehicles that were connected to the Vitali operations through legitimate business channels. She found it at 2 a.m, sitting at the desk in the penthouse with 4 spreadsheets open and a cup of cold coffee, and the particular clarity that came at the end of a long analysis when the pattern finally assembled itself. She called Caesar. He was awake. He was always awake when she called at strange hours, which she had initially attributed to light sleeping, and had come to understand as something more intentional. He's already in, she said. A pause. Show me. She was not surprised that his first response was show me, and not disbelief. He was not a man who wasted energy on refusing information. She went through it. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for longer than he usually was, a full 30 seconds, which from Caesar was the equivalent of a considerable reaction. Who else knows this? He said. No one. I just found it. Don't discuss it with anyone, he said. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 17. They went through it together, her walking him through the vehicle structure, him asking questions that were specific and penetrating, the two of them at the desk in the amber light of the penthouse office, thinking through the architecture of a threat that had been patient and invisible, and was now neither. He doesn't know you found it, Caesar said. Not yet. This gives us an advantage that we won't have once he knows, he said. We need to move before he realizes the exposure has been identified. What's the move? He thought for a moment. There are 3 things that need to happen simultaneously. The vehicles need to be dissolved. I have the legal architecture to do that. It just requires execution at a speed he won't expect. The 4 channels he's using need to be closed with a specific language that makes his stake unrecoverable. And Farrar himself needs to understand, through a communication that can't be traced to me, that the operation is aware of him. Why the communication? Because a man like Farrar, who has been patient and invisible for 2 years, is also a man who understands when a position has been lost, Caesar said. If he receives the signal without the confrontation, he'll withdraw quietly. If he feels cornered, he'll get loud, and loud gets attention we don't want. What kind of signal? Caesar looked at her. A card player's signal, he said. Something that communicates. I see your hand. The game is over. Walk away. She held that for a moment. Then, I can deliver it. He looked at her. Not me personally, she said, but I know how to construct a message through channels he'll read and that can't be traced. It's the same mechanism I use when I've identified a mark and want them to know their game is up without the casino knowing I'm the one who identified it. This is more dangerous than a casino, he said. I know, she said. I'm not suggesting anything that creates a thread back to either of us. I'm suggesting a clean signal through legitimate financial channels that communicates the information without the fingerprints. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, and she saw in it something that was new and different from the tenderness and the desire and the focused pleasure. She saw, in its full form, his professional regard. The respect of a very good operator, recognizing the specific quality of another very good operator. Yes, he said, Walk me through it." She walked him through it. It took 2 days to execute. The legal dissolution, which his lawyers handled through an emergency weekend session, the channel closings, which were structural and could be done internally, and the signal, which she constructed with the care she brought to her most complex work. Clean, untraceable, precisely calibrated to communicate exactly what was needed and nothing beyond it. Farrar received it on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, all 4 vehicles had initiated withdrawal proceedings. By the following Monday, the name Farrar did not appear in connection with any of the Vitali operation structures. Caesar told her the Thursday result in the penthouse that evening, and the telling was brief and quiet, and she heard in his voice the specific quality of something settled, the note of a man who had been carrying a significant weight and had set it down. "You built the exit for him," he said. "Before I would have thought of it." "You were managing the structural side," she said. "Someone needed to think about the human side." "You always think about the human side," he said. She looked at him. "It's how I was trained, by a world that was trying to use it against me." She paused. "I prefer this use." He crossed the room, and she met him halfway, which was something they'd been doing in multiple senses for months. And he held her with the quality of someone who understood that the person in their arms was not a thing to be held, but a person who had chosen to be close. And the distinction was something she felt in the architecture of how he held her. "Thank you," he said into her hair. "Don't thank me," she said. "I work here now." He pulled back enough to look at her. "Do you?" She looked up at him. "I think I do," she said, "if that's the offer." "That's the offer," he said. "It's been the offer for a while." "I know," she said. "I'm saying yes." They went back to Tuscany in June, and this time it was not business. The vineyard in early summer was different from the vineyard in winter. The vines were in leaf. The hills were a specific green that she did not have an adequate English word for, and that the Italian word verde also didn't quite capture. A green that was dense and living and slightly unreal. The air smelled of dry grass and rosemary and the particular dry stone smell of land that had been worked for centuries. They had the farmhouse to themselves. The vineyard manager came by in the mornings and left them to the afternoons, which were long and warm and had a quality of time that she hadn't experienced since childhood, time that was not managed, not operationally structured, not directed toward any outcome. She read. She had not read for pleasure in years. There had always been operational reading, the research, the financial documents, the intelligence gathering. Now she sat in the garden behind the farmhouse with a novel from Caesar's shelf and read it slowly, in the afternoon heat, in a chair that had been sitting in that specific spot long enough to have shaped itself to the weight of occupancy. Caesar worked in the mornings, calls, emails, the ongoing management of a complex operation that didn't stop because the operator was in Tuscany. But the afternoons were his too. He walked the vineyards with the focused attentiveness of someone for whom the place was not a retreat, but a continuation of something essential. She joined him on the 3rd day, and he taught her about the vines with the same quality of patient intelligence he brought to everything. "Your grandmother planted these?" she asked at the end of the eastern row, looking back at the farmhouse against the sky. "Some of them. The oldest ones she inherited. These," he touched a vine with the back of his hand, "she planted in 1973. The year your father married her daughter," she said, because she'd done the math. "Yes," he said. "She planted them the year her daughter married, into a life she'd hoped would be different. She said the vines were her way of ensuring something good would come out of it." Mia looked at him. He was looking at the farmhouse, and the expression on his face was one she'd rarely seen. Unguarded, openly tender, the architecture down. "She was right," Mia said. He turned to look at her. Then he put his arm around her shoulders, which was the comfortable, easy gesture of two people who had been in proximity long enough for comfort to have grown around the early electricity, not replacing it, but building around it, the way growth built around things. "Come," he said. "The light is good." On the fifth evening, sitting on the terrace, with the valley going amber below and a bottle of the estate wine between them, he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. He was not nervous. Caesar Vitali did not precisely experience nervousness, but there was a quality of the space around him that suggested he was in a moment that mattered more than usual. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not now, if you're not ready. Not soon, if it's too soon. But I want you to know that it's what I want, and that the asking is real and not a wager." She looked at him for a long moment. "Not a wager," she said. "No," he said. "This is the one thing in my life I'm not willing to make into a game." She thought about the brownstone at 4 a.m. with tea. She thought about the vineyard in winter and the scar below his ear. She thought about the note on the table. "Don't leave." She thought about two people on opposite sides of a baccarat table, both holding cards they could have played differently, both choosing something else. "Ask me," she said. "The actual question." He reached into the pocket of his jacket. He was wearing the charcoal suit, which was the suit she associated with the first time she'd seen him at the bar, with the wine she hadn't drunk, and the 3 seconds she'd stood at the entrance reading the room. And he set a ring on the table between them. Not a large ring, a small, precise diamond in a setting she recognized as antique, that someone had clearly chosen for itself rather than for its size. Not the ring of a man trying to demonstrate resources. The ring of a man who had looked at something specific and thought, "That." "Will you marry me?" he said. "Amelia Grace Rousseau, who is Mia Fontaine, who plays cards better than I do and thinks faster than anyone I've met, and who makes Chicago feel like a place I live rather than a place I operate." He paused. "Will you stay?" She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She looked at the valley, which was going on being itself, ancient and patient, without any opinion on the matter. "You lost a game deliberately," she said. "To keep me." "Yes." "And I was going to lose deliberately," she said. "To stay." "Yes." "We were both," she said, "completely compromised long before the cards were dealt." "Yes," he said. She picked up the ring from the table. She held it for a moment. The diamond caught the last light and did something small and precise with it. "Yes," she said. He took the ring from her hand and slid it onto her finger, and she looked at it there, in the Tuscan evening, with the valley below and the vines behind, and the old stone of the farmhouse at their backs. She thought, "This is what it is to land somewhere." She thought, "My mother would have liked this." She thought, "I wonder if the vineyard manager knows how to cook the pasta." Caesar's hand was over hers on the table. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the descending dark with the wine between them, and the valley went on and on into the night. They came back to Chicago in July, and the city was different in summer. Or rather, the city was the same, and she was different, which produced the same perceptual result. She had the bracelet and the ring on her left wrist and hand, and the bracelet was her mother's, and the ring was his grandmother's. He told her this on the plane back, the ring's history, that it had been his grandmother's engagement ring, that Marco had kept it in a box in the stone building for 15 years, waiting for the son to find someone worthy of it. "Your father gave you the ring," she said. "He pressed it into my hand the morning we left for the airport," Caesar said. "He said, 'Don't come back from Italy without using it.'" She thought about the lunch at the North Side Sicilian restaurant, about the pasta and the sparkling water and the 50 years of assessment, about the man who had said, "Don't come back from Italy without using it." "He knew before you asked," she said. "My father always knows," Caesar said. "It's the quality I find most irritating and most useful about him." The city received them with the indifference of cities. It had not stopped while they were gone, had continued its million private stories without any awareness of their interruption. But at the Aurelius, which was the first place she went the morning after their return, There was a quality of response that was different from the one she'd arrived to that first night, in the burgundy dress, with her 3-second assessment of the room and her operational intentions. Sophia met her at the door. Not formally, just met her, the way you met someone you'd been expecting. The quarterly numbers came in, Sophia said. The October restructuring showed a 14% increase in revenue with a 22% decrease in tax exposure. She paused. The lawyers wanted me to tell you they're sorry they ever doubted the model. They doubted it to my face, Mia said. I know. They're very sorry. Marco came by the Aurelius that afternoon, unannounced, which was his prerogative and his habit. He looked at her left hand when she poured him coffee, and he nodded once, the compressed, dense nod of a man who received a confirmation he had expected, and about which he had arranged strong feelings. Good, he said. Thank you for the ring, she said. It was hers, he said. She would want it back in use. He drank his coffee. She always said the ring had more work to do. She wore it for 40 years and then sat in a box for 15, and that's not enough for a ring like that. I'll put it to work, she said. He looked at her. The 50-year assessment, applied at close range. Yes, he said. I believe you will. In the evenings, she had a project she worked on in the suite, a room of her own, separate from the penthouse office, that had been furnished over the preceding months with the gradual accumulation of her own things, her own books, her own small Morandi print she'd bought at the gallery in Pilsen. She was writing, which was something she had not done since college. Not journaling, not operational notes, but the deliberate construction of something. She was writing down the method. Not a manual, nothing prescriptive, nothing that pretended the specific intelligence she'd developed was teachable in a document, but a record of principles, the way she read rooms, the way she identified the architecture of situations, the way she distinguished between what people were doing and what they wanted. She had a thought that it might be useful in the operation. She had a secondary thought that it might be useful more broadly than that there were people in the world who could benefit from learning to read the situations they were in rather than simply reacting to them. She mentioned this to Caesar one evening. He read what she'd written, 20 pages so far, without speaking. He read it the way he read everything, with full attention and without interruption. When he finished, he set it down on the table between them. This is remarkable, he said. It's a start. No, he said. It's a book. He looked at it, then at her. You should publish it. Under which name? Yours, he said. Either of them, or both. She thought about that. About Mia Fontaine and Amelia Russo and the white gold bracelet and the ring. About the life she'd built in careful solitude and the life she was building now, which was neither solitary nor careless. I'll think about it, she said. You've already decided, he said. You're using the same voice you use when you've decided something, and are giving yourself time to arrive at the announcement. She looked at him. He was watching her with the slight, dry movement of his mouth that she had, over months, come to understand as his fullest form of delight. I hate that you can read me, she said. You love it, he said. She did. She loved it the way she'd always loved the tables, the electricity of playing against someone who is genuinely good enough to make the game worth playing. I'm going to Monaco next month, she said. There's a casino there that owes me a rematch. I'll come, he said. It'll be boring for you, she said. You don't play commercially. I'll watch, he said. You're interesting to watch. You've told me this. Repeatedly, he said. Because it's repeatedly true. He refilled her wine glass. Monaco in August. We can stay on the coast. I know a place. You always know a place. I have resources, he said, with the dry precision she loved. I apply them. She laughed. He watched the laugh the way he always watched it, like a man who had access to a remarkable thing and was never going to stop finding it remarkable. Outside, Chicago moved through its summer evening, indifferent and continuous, and full of its million private stories. Inside the suite, above the amber-lit floors of the Aurelius, two people sat with their wine and their project and the ring on her finger and the particular quality of people who had arrived somewhere and were, for the first time in their respective histories, entirely content to stay. The book was published the following spring under the name M.G. Rousseau, not under Mia Fontaine, which was the name connected to professional activity she still preferred to keep below the horizon of official attention. Not under Amelia Grace Rousseau, which felt like too much of a return to someone she'd mostly left in New Orleans. M.G. Rousseau was precise and true, and belonged to both of the people she'd been. The book was not about gambling. It was about reading, about the specific skill of watching human behavior in high-stakes situations and understanding the architecture beneath the performance. It was framed as a business and decision-making text, which was not inaccurate, and which was more commercially viable than a memoir about a former con artist turned crime family strategist, which would have required more disclosure than she was prepared to offer. It was, within 3 months of publication, in its 4th printing. She found this genuinely amusing. Caesar found it predictable. "You understand people better than any professional communicator I've encountered," he said. "Writing a book about it and having it read widely is the obvious outcome." "Most people would find this alarming," she said. "A book that teaches people to see through other people's strategies?" "Most people," he said, "are not the kind of reader you want. The people who can use this are the people who already read well and want to be better. The people who can't read won't understand it." "That's a generous assessment." "It's an accurate one," he said. He was reading the book review she'd been given in a major business publication, the one that called her work a paradigm-shifting approach to situational analysis, with the expression of a man who was pleased and also slightly impatient with the reviewer's limitations. "He doesn't understand the chapter on deception. He thinks it's about telling lies. It's about telling the difference between what someone is doing and what they mean." "Few people tell the difference," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's why you wrote it." Monaco had been, as she'd predicted, boring for him and excellent for her. She had cleared 300,000 euros from a casino that had been, for the preceding decade, considered unbeatable, a claim that she had found professionally offensive and had resolved within 4 visits over 2 weeks. Caesar had watched from the private gallery that the casino maintained for high rollers who didn't want to be seen on the floor, and she had been aware of his attention with the same precision she'd always been aware of it, the second gravitational field, and had found that it sharpened rather than distracted her game. Afterward, in the hotel suite with its view of the harbor and the boats below, and the Mediterranean doing its warm, ancient thing, she had told him the full method for the first time. Not the summary version, not the principles she'd written down, but the specific technical process, how she read the physical tells, how she mapped the decision architecture of each player, how she constructed the behavioral model in real time that allowed her to predict responses before they occurred. He listened with the same quality of attention he brought to operational briefings. He asked questions that were precise and intelligent. At the end, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're more gifted than I realized," he said. "You knew I was good." "I knew you were exceptional," he said. "I didn't know the specific mechanism until now. The model building, in real time, that's not a trained skill. That's architecture. Cognitive architecture, that you've refined but didn't construct." He paused. "It's who you are." She held that. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." "Then don't let it go," he said. "Whatever you do from here, the book, the work, the operation, don't let the part that builds models in real time become only operational. Keep it for yourself. Keep it for the tables." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because it's the most beautiful thing about you," he said, "and I want it to remain entirely yours." She had nothing to say to that. She held it the way she held the ring, as something that had been given cleanly and that she intended to wear for the rest of her life. The wedding was in October, at the vineyard, on a Saturday with the unreasonable light that Tuscany reserved for important occasions. There were not many people, 40 perhaps, the tightest ring of the family and the operation and the handful of individuals she'd brought into her own life over the years. Devra was there, which had surprised both of them. They had not been close, in any conventional sense, but Devra had been the person most consistently present at the edges of her working life, and inviting her had felt like completing a circuit. Marco walked her in. This had not been his suggestion, or hers. It had been Caesar's. He had asked, carefully, whether she would want his father to do it, understanding that the question implied something about her own father and her own history, which he understood clearly. She had said yes, because Marco Vitali was the only available candidate for the role, and because, since the Northside lunch, she had come to understand him as someone she genuinely respected. Caesar was standing at the end of the aisle, the vineyard's long eastern row, the vines in their October gold, in a suit as dark as the first one she'd seen him in, looking at her coming toward him with the expression she had been cataloging for over a year, and that she still, every time, had to settle into before she could fully receive it. She had chosen a dress the color of winter champagne. She had her mother's bracelet on her left wrist and his grandmother's ring on her finger, and she wore no other jewelry. The ceremony was brief. They had written their own vows, which they had not shared with each other beforehand, on the mutual agreement that they were both people who functioned better without knowing the full hand before the game started. His vows were precise and honest, and contained 3 things she had not expected, one of which made her laugh, and 2 of which, taken together, produced the particular sensation of being fully seen. She had not cried at any point in the preceding months, had not been someone who cried as a general principle, but at the 3rd unexpected thing in his vows, she felt her eyes do something they did not often do, and she let them, because she was among people who were allowed to see her, because that was the point, and because her mother would have found the stoic alternative considerably less satisfying. She said her vows. They were longer than his, and she had worked on them for 3 weeks and revised them substantially, the way she revised everything she cared about. He listened to them with his full attention, his dark eyes on hers, and at a specific line, not the most significant line, but one she'd included for him specifically, knowing he would recognize it as their private language. She saw the thing happen in his face that happened when she said something that reached him. Marco, standing at the end of the eastern row with his hands clasped and his 50 years of assessment directed at the proceedings, made the not laugh sound that she had come to identify as his fullest expression of emotion. The vines held the October light. The valley went on beyond them, ancient and patient. They were married on a Saturday in October, in a vineyard that had been planted by a woman who had said they had more work to do. And for the first time in both of their lives, neither of them was thinking about the next move, the exit strategy, the operational calculus of the next play. They were simply there. A year later, she was back at the baccarat table. Not the Aurelius's back room, though that table was still there, still lit by its focused chandelier, still hosting games that were not registered with the Illinois Gaming Board. A different table, in a different city. She had accepted an invitation, carefully vetted, thoroughly researched, run through the full architecture of her risk assessment, to play in a private game in New York, at a location she knew, and with players she had a complete intelligence read on. She played for 6 hours. She won consistently, with the particular quality of winning that she'd always preferred. Not spectacular, not ostentatious, but steady and unmistakable. The kind of winning that communicated, over the course of an evening, that the person doing it was in a different category of player from everyone else at the table. At the break between rounds, the host, a man she'd met twice before in the context of the operation, a respectable man in the sense that the word respectable had in this world, approached her. "Mrs. Vitali," he said, and the name still landed slightly new each time, like a key in a lock you'd owned for a while, but we're still getting used to the weight of. Mr. Chen, she said. I have a proposition, he said. She held her wine glass and looked at him with the reading expression, the one that mapped and assessed and built the model in real time, and said, Tell me. He told her. It was a proposal involving a new establishment he was opening in London, and a role he thought she was uniquely positioned to fill, not as a player, but as what she actually was, which was an analyst, a reader of rooms, a person who could be placed in a new environment and understand its architecture within hours. She heard him out. She asked 4 questions. She said she would think about it. She called Caesar from the car on the way to the airport. How was the game? He said. Good, she said. I met with Chen. I know, he said. Sophia told me he'd be there. Were you surveilling my game? Sophia has contacts in common with Chen, he said, with the specific precision of a man walking the line between transparency and defensiveness. It came up. Caesar. Yes? If you're going to have me watched, she said, at least watch effectively. The tell was the 4th hand, not the 6th. A pause. Then, what? The tell that I was running a specific strategy. You'd have seen it at the 4th hand if you were watching properly. She paused. Tell Sophia to send whoever she sent a better brief next time. A longer pause. Then he made a sound she'd heard perhaps 6 times in a year and a half. A real laugh, fully formed, the sound of a man who was genuinely surprised by delight. You saw the watcher, he said. I see everything, she said. You know this. I know this, he said, still laughing, and she heard in his laughter the thing she'd fallen in love with. Not the composed surface, not the dark authority, not the architecture of capability and control, but the person inside it, who is capable of being surprised, who wanted the game to be worth playing, who had sat at the most important table of his life and folded a winning hand because he wanted someone to stay. Chen wants me in London, she said. I know what he wants, Caesar said. I'm interested. I know, he said. We should talk about it. We will, she said, when I'm back. When will you be back? Tomorrow evening, she said. 7 o'clock. I'll have dinner waiting, he said. Not takeout. The real thing. Your grandmother's pasta? If you're lucky, he said. I'm very lucky, she said. I've been running the numbers. Outside the car window, New York did what it always did. Enormous, indifferent, brilliant, full of its million stories. Inside the car, she held her phone to her ear and listened to the sound of him arranging things on the other end of the line. She could hear it, the specific quality of his attention organizing itself, moving from the conversation to the next operational task and back, the dual-channel focus of a man who managed everything. And she thought about the vineyard in October, and about her mother's kitchen, and about the first night at the Aurelius, when she'd stood at the entrance for 3 seconds, reading the room, and decided, interesting. She had been right. It had been the most interesting room she'd ever entered. It had also been the last room she'd needed to enter as a stranger. Caesar, she said. Yes? I know you through the game. A silence. Then, you knew for a while. Since March, she said. The notebook. A pause. I should have hidden it better. You didn't want to hide it, she said. You wanted me to find it. He was quiet. And then, yes. You wanted me to know that you chose, she said. That it wasn't the cards. That it was a choice. Yes, he said, very quietly. I needed you to know that I wanted you to stay, more than I needed to win. A pause. I've won every game I've played since I was 20. Winning was not a question. And then you sat down across from me, and winning became a question. And the question was whether you were what winning looked like. She was quiet. "You are," he said, "for the record." The car was on the bridge now, the city behind her, the airport ahead. The lights of the bridge moved past the windows like a slow, deliberate shuffle of a deck, and she thought about the two-handed game. The natural 9 on the first hand, the redeal, the banker 9 on the second, and about how there were hands where the cards were irrelevant, where the outcome had been determined long before anyone sat down, by the forces that had moved two specific people toward the same table in the same room on the same night. She had read rooms her whole life. She had read people, read tells, read the hidden architecture of other people's desires and fears. She had made her living from the gap between what people appeared to be and what they actually wanted. She had not read herself. She had not read herself clearly enough to know what she wanted. For the years of forward motion, of tables and cities, and the brilliant, lonely work of being the most intelligent person in every room she left. She had not read herself until a man with dark eyes and his grandmother's pasta and a rooftop above a lake had sat across from her and read her first. And then she had read him back, and they had both looked at their cards and made the same choice. "I'll be home tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll be here." She hung up the phone and looked out at the lights of the bridge and the dark water below, and the city behind her and the road ahead. And she held in both hands the full, complicated architecture of the life she had built. Not the one she'd planned, not the one she'd managed and controlled and constructed from the first principles of independence and self-sufficiency and the philosophical necessity of needing no one. This one. The one with the ring and the bracelet and the book and the vineyard and the man who watched her play and thought, "Remarkable," and meant it about all of her, not just the table. She put the phone in her bag. She looked at the road ahead. She was not afraid. The final bet, she had concluded, was not the baccarat hand, or the wager, or even the proposal in the Tuscan evening light. The final bet was the one you made every day, with everything available in you, on the proposition that staying was worth it, that the person across the table was worth the hand you were showing them, that the game, after all the games, was this one. She had been making that bet for over a year. She intended to go on making it. The car moved through the bridge lights toward the airport, and behind her the city carried on, and somewhere in Chicago, a man was cooking his grandmother's pasta and waiting for 7 o'clock, and the cards were all on the table, face up, finally, and everything they showed was real. The house always wins, except the one time it doesn't. Except the one time it folds the winning hand and looks across the table and thinks, "This